Hey folks, tonight we're exploring something that'll probably keep you up thinking even though you're trying to fall asleep, the most accurate dream predictions that actually came true. And I'm talking about dreams so precise, so specific that they basically work better than your weather app. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing our global insomniac community checking in from everywhere. Now, dim those lights, grab your favorite blanket, and prepare to question everything you think you know about dreams and reality. And don't worry if you drift off halfway through. That's kind of the point. Though honestly, some of these stories are so wild you might stay awake longer than planned. You know, I've always wondered about that moment when someone wakes up from a dream and thinks that felt way too real. Well, tonight we're talking about people who had that feeling and then watched their dreams play out exactly in real life. Dreams don't just happen to you, they happen through you. And sometimes, apparently, they happen before you. Anyway, let's start with what might be the most famous prophetic dream in history, involving a guy who definitely should have listened to his subconscious. So picture this. It's March 14th, 44 BC in Rome, and Calpurnia, Julius Caesar's wife, jolts awake in a cold sweat from what might be the most prophetic nightmare in human history. And we're not talking about some vague, symbolic dream nonsense where you're flying through clouds or showing up naked to a Senate meeting, though, honestly, that would have been less embarrassing than what actually happened to Caesar. This was full-color, surround sound, director's cut horror. In her dream, she saw Caesar stabbed to death in excruciating detail. Multiple wounds, blood everywhere, him collapsing and dying in her arms while senators stood around like they were watching a gladiator match. She could smell the metallic scent of blood, hear the specific sound his body made hitting the marble floor, and feel his final breath against her cheek as he whispered her name. But here's what makes this dream absolutely chilling. It wasn't just the murder that was so vivid. Calpurnia dreamed about the entire day. She saw Caesar waking up reluctant to go to the Senate, saw him changing his mind multiple times, saw specific senators approaching him with fake smiles and daggers hidden in their togas. She even dreamed about the exact words Brutus would say, "Et tu, Brute?" Which, by the way, probably wasn't actually said in real life, but the sentiment was definitely there. I mean, imagine waking up from a dream where you've essentially watched your husband's murder play out like a Netflix series, complete with dialogue and camera angles. I'd probably never let him leave the house again. When Calpurnia woke up, she was crying and shaking so violently that she woke Caesar, who found her clutching the sheets and mumbling about blood and betrayal. She immediately started begging him not to go to the Senate that day. And here's where it gets really interesting. This wasn't just a worried wife having anxiety dreams. Calpurnia was known for being practical, level-headed, not given to hysteria or superstition. Caesar was genuinely shaken by her distress. The guy who had conquered Gaul, who had crossed the Rubicon saying, "The die is cast," who basically invented the phrase, "I came, I saw, I conquered," was seriously considering staying home because his wife had a bad dream. He spent the morning pacing around their villa, looking troubled and asking the household priests to perform extra sacrifices to read the omens. But then his buddies showed up, because what could possibly go wrong with peer pressure in ancient Rome? Brutus himself was among the group that came to escort Caesar to the Senate. Can you imagine the balls on this guy? Standing in Caesar's living room, looking him in the eye and saying, "Come on, Julius. You can't let a dream control the most powerful man in the world." They convinced him that canceling a Senate meeting because of his wife's nightmare would make him look weak and superstitious. What will people say if the great Julius Caesar is afraid of shadows in the night? They asked. The other senators are already questioning your growing power. Don't give them ammunition by appearing to be controlled by feminine fears. So Caesar made the fatal decision. He kissed Calpurnia goodbye, and she clung to him, still begging him to stay. According to historical accounts, she was crying and said, "If you must go, at least take extra guards." "Promise me you'll be careful," Caesar promised, but then he didn't actually take extra security. Because apparently even when your wife has prophetic dreams about your murder, male ego still wins. The really tragic part is that there were other warning signs that day. A soothsayer famously told Caesar to beware the Ides of March, which was that very day. Animal sacrifices kept producing bad omens. Even Caesar's own dreams the night before had been disturbing, though not as specific as Calpurnia's. And then, of course, it all played out exactly as she had dreamed. Caesar arrived at the Senate, and within an hour he was dead. 23 stab wounds, just as Calpurnia had seen. He collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, bleeding out on the marble floor while senators who had just been shaking his hand stood over his body. The most haunting detail? When they brought news of Caesar's death to Calpurnia, she reportedly said, "I saw this. I watched it happen. I tried to stop it." She spent the rest of her life, which wasn't long as she died of grief within 2 years, telling anyone who would listen that dreams sometimes show us things we need to know, even when we can't change them. What I find absolutely fascinating about Calpurnia's story is how detailed and accurate her dream was. She didn't just sense danger, she saw the actual event unfold with documentary-level precision. Makes you wonder if our brains sometimes pick up on subtle signals that our conscious minds miss. Or maybe time works differently in dreams than we think it does. You know what's really disturbing, though? Calpurnia's dream became famous throughout Rome after Caesar's assassination. People started saying she was touched by the gods, that she had been given a divine warning that mortals were too proud to heed. But here's the thing, if people had actually listened to her, if they had taken a woman's dream seriously in a society that barely took women seriously at all, one of history's most famous assassinations might never have happened. Speaking of dreams that were way too accurate for anyone's comfort, and way too ignored by the people who should have been paying attention, there's this other story about a mother's worst nightmare becoming reality in the most specific, heartbreaking way possible. Here's something that'll mess with your head and make you question everything you think you know about time, fate, and maternal intuition. In early 1815, Letizia Romolino Bonaparte, Napoleon's mother, and honestly one of the toughest women in European history, had a dream so vivid and disturbing that she not only wrote it down immediately, but she also sent detailed letters about it to family members across Europe. Now, this wasn't just some worried mother having anxiety dreams about her famous son. Letizia had watched Napoleon conquer most of the known world. She'd seen him crown himself Emperor of France, survive multiple assassination attempts, and escape from exile on Elba like some kind of 19th century action hero. At this point in history, Napoleon seemed basically unstoppable. He was planning his return to power, gathering loyal troops, and everyone expected him to reclaim his empire. But Letizia's dream was different, terrifyingly specific. She dreamed of her son's final, complete downfall in detail that would make a war correspondent jealous. She saw muddy fields stretching for miles, rain falling so hard it turned the ground into a swamp, and thousands of soldiers struggling through knee-deep muck. She heard the thunder of cannons mixed with actual thunder from storms, creating a symphony of destruction that she said was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, even in her worst nightmares. In her dream, she saw Napoleon on a white horse, which was historically accurate, as he always rode white horses into battle, but this time he looked defeated before the fighting even began. She watched him realize that his cavalry couldn't charge effectively through the mud, that his artillery was getting stuck, that everything that had made him victorious in previous battles was working against him. But here's where the dream gets really eerie. Letizia saw specific faces of enemy commanders she'd never met, including the Duke of Wellington, whom she described perfectly in her letters even though she'd never seen him before. She saw Prussian reinforcements arriving at exactly the moment when Napoleon's forces were most vulnerable. She even saw the approximate time of day when her son's final charge would fail, late afternoon, when the sun was low and the shadows were long. Imagine being a mother and watching your child's complete destruction play out in your dreams like some kind of cosmic spoiler alert. The psychological torture of knowing exactly how your son's story would end and being completely powerless to change it. The most disturbing part of Letizia's dream wasn't just the military defeat, it was what came after. She saw Napoleon isolated, powerless, stripped of everything that had defined him. She dreamed of him pacing in a small room on what she described as a rock in the middle of endless water, slowly losing his mind as he dictated his memoirs to a secretary who barely spoke French. She saw her son dying alone, thousands of miles from France, with only a handful of loyal servants around him. In her dream, he kept calling for her in his final moments, but she couldn't reach him because there was too much water, too much distance. She said she woke up feeling like she'd actually watched her son die, and the grief was so real she spent days in mourning before reminding herself it had only been a dream. 3 months later, everything began unfolding exactly as she had dreamed. The Battle of Waterloo happened on June 18, 1815, and every detail matched her vision. The rain turned the battlefield into a muddy nightmare. Napoleon's cavalry charges failed because horses couldn't maintain footing. The artillery got bogged down. Wellington's forces held their positions exactly as she'd seen. Prussian reinforcements arrived at precisely the moment she'd dreamed they would. And then came the exile to St. Helena, literally a rock in the ocean, just as she had described. Napoleon spent 6 years on that remote island, pacing in small rooms, dictating his memoirs, slowly deteriorating both physically and mentally. He died there in 1821, calling out for his mother in his final delirium, exactly as Letizia had dreamed 6 years earlier, the really heartbreaking part. Letizia lived until 1836, long enough to see every detail of her nightmare come true. She spent the last 15 years of her life knowing exactly how her son's story would end, watching it play out step by step like a slow-motion tragedy she'd already witnessed. What I find absolutely haunting about this story is the specificity of details that Letizia couldn't have known through any normal means. She'd never been to Belgium, never seen a battlefield in that kind of weather, never met the commanders she described so accurately. Yet somehow her subconscious mind had fast-forwarded through events that wouldn't happen for months, gathering information that seemed to come from nowhere. There's something profoundly sad about prophetic dreams when they show tragedies you can't prevent. I mean, what do you even do with information like that? Call your son and say, "Hey, Napoleon, I know you're busy planning to reconquer Europe, but maybe avoid muddy fields?" The poor woman spent her final years being right about the worst possible thing, and being completely helpless to change any of it. Sometimes I think the cruelest thing about prophetic dreams is that they show you the future, but they don't give you the power to fix it. They're like cosmic spoilers for a movie you don't want to see but can't stop watching. Speaking of dreams that predicted tragedy with surgical precision, there's another story that's even more chilling because it involves someone dreaming about their own death with such accuracy that it's almost like the universe was giving them a personalized preview of their final scene. About 10 days before his assassination, Abraham Lincoln had what might be the most haunting prophetic dream in American political history. And this wasn't just any random nightmare. This was a detailed, cinematically precise vision of his own funeral that he shared with multiple people, almost like he was trying to warn them about something he knew was coming but couldn't quite bring himself to say directly. Picture this. It's early April 1865. Lincoln has just won the Civil War, the country is finally healing, and the president should be celebrating the greatest achievement of his career. Instead, he's having recurring nightmares that are so vivid and disturbing that they're affecting his daily behavior. Mary Lincoln later said that he'd been acting strange for weeks, more contemplative than usual, almost like he was quietly saying goodbye to people without actually saying goodbye. In the dream, Lincoln found himself walking through the White House in the middle of the night, following the sound of people crying. But it wasn't just soft weeping. He described it as soul-deep grief, the kind of mourning that comes from national tragedy. He walked through corridors he knew intimately, but everything felt different, draped in black fabric and filled with shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. As he followed the sound, he noticed that the usual White House staff and guards were nowhere to be seen. Instead, there were soldiers everywhere, not his usual security detail, but formal honor guards in full dress uniform, standing at attention with their rifles. The atmosphere was so heavy with grief that Lincoln said he could physically feel it pressing down on him like a weight. When he reached the East Room, he found it transformed into something he'd never seen but somehow recognized, a formal state funeral chamber. There was a coffin surrounded by mourners, all dressed in black, many of them crying openly. Important political figures, military officers, foreign dignitaries, and ordinary citizens were all gathered together in shared grief that Lincoln described as more profound than anything I'd witnessed during the war. But here's the detail that made this dream absolutely terrifying. Lincoln couldn't see who was in the coffin. Every time he tried to approach it, to look at the face of the deceased, something would block his view. Other mourners would step in front of him, or shadows would fall across the casket, or he'd suddenly find himself farther away than he'd been moments before. Finally, in the dream, he managed to ask a soldier standing guard, "Who is dead in the White House? Who has died to cause such terrible grief?" And the soldier, without looking at him, replied in a voice that Lincoln said was cold as winter, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln said he woke up in a cold sweat, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he was still dreaming or if he'd somehow glimpsed into another timeline. The dream was so realistic that he actually got up and walked through the White House corridors, checking to make sure everything was normal, that there were no mourners, no coffin, no soldiers standing guard over his own funeral. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Lincoln had always been interested in dreams and omens. He'd grown up in frontier Kentucky, where folk beliefs about prophetic dreams were common. His mother had taught him to pay attention to vivid dreams, especially ones that repeated or felt more real than real. So when he had this nightmare, he didn't dismiss it as stress or indigestion. He took it seriously. Lincoln told several people about this dream, including his wife Mary, his bodyguard Ward Hill Lamont, and several cabinet members. Mary was terrified and begged him to increase his security detail, to cancel public appearances, to basically go into hiding until the danger passed. But Lincoln's response was both fatalistic and philosophical. Well, if it's meant to happen, it'll happen whether I hide in a bunker or continue doing my job. Ward Hill Lamont, who was responsible for Lincoln's security, later wrote that the president seemed almost resigned to his fate after this dream. He continued with his normal schedule, but he started making comments that seemed like he was preparing people for his death. He'd make offhand remarks about "when I'm gone," or "after my time here is finished," casual references to his own mortality that were uncharacteristic for a man who usually focused on the future. 10 days later, on April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater. And here's where the dream becomes absolutely eerie in its accuracy. Every detail that Lincoln had seen came true with documentary precision. His body was displayed in the East Room of the White House, exactly as he'd dreamed. The room was draped in black fabric and filled with the same mixture of political figures, military officers, and grieving citizens he'd seen in his nightmare. The honor guards were there, standing at attention with their rifles. The profound grief he'd sensed was real. The entire nation was mourning, not just a president, but the man who had saved the Union and freed the slaves. Foreign dignitaries came to pay their respects, just as he'd seen. Even the timing was right. The funeral took place during the day, but the viewing and preparation had happened in the middle of the night, exactly when his dream had taken place. But here's the detail that still gives me chills. Lincoln never saw his own face in the dream coffin. And there's something almost merciful about that, isn't there? Like his subconscious was trying to protect him from the full horror of witnessing his own death, even in a dream. He saw everything else with perfect clarity, but that one detail was obscured, as if the universe was saying, "You need to know this is coming, but you don't need to see yourself dead." What I find most haunting about Lincoln's story is how he seemed to accept his fate after the dream. Several people noted that he appeared different in those final days, more at peace, almost serene, like someone who had made peace with an inevitable future. It's as if the dream hadn't just shown him what was coming, but had somehow prepared him to face it with dignity. Makes you wonder if prophetic dreams are warnings meant to change the future, or if they're sometimes just cosmic preparations for tragedies that are already written in stone. Either way, Lincoln's final dream stands as one of the most documented and accurate predictions of personal tragedy in American history. Speaking of dreams that were disturbingly accurate about family tragedy, there's another story that involves someone seeing a loved one's death with such specific detail that it challenges everything we think we know about the relationship between sleeping minds and future events. Mark Twain once had a dream so realistic and emotionally devastating that he woke up in genuine grief for his brother Henry, who was very much alive and peacefully sleeping in the next room. But this wasn't just a vague anxiety dream about something bad happening to someone he loved. This was a detailed, specific vision of Henry's death that included elements so precise they seemed impossible to predict through any normal means. Now, to understand why this dream was so significant, you need to know about Twain's relationship with his younger brother Henry. They weren't just siblings, they were best friends, working together on Mississippi River steamboats, sharing adventures, and genuinely enjoying each other's company in a way. That was somewhat unusual for brothers in the 1850s. Henry was the responsible one, steady and reliable, while Sam, Mark Twain's real name was Samuel Clemens, was the dreamer and storyteller. They balanced each other perfectly. In the spring of 1858, both brothers were working on riverboats, dangerous work in an era when steamboat explosions, fires, and sinkings were unfortunately common. But they were experienced rivermen, and Henry in particular was known for being careful and safety conscious. There was no reason for Twain to be particularly worried about his brother's well-being. Then came the dream that changed everything. Twain dreamed he was in his sister's living room in St. Louis, but the furniture had been rearranged for a funeral. There was a metallic coffin, not wooden, which was standard at the time, but specifically metal, sitting in the center of the room. The coffin was open, and inside was Henry, dressed in one of Twain's suits because his own clothes had been destroyed in whatever accident had killed him. But here's where the dream gets incredibly specific and, in hindsight, impossibly accurate. In the dream, Henry looked peaceful but too young to be dead. His face was unmarked, but Twain somehow knew that he had died from internal injuries rather than external trauma. And here's the detail that haunted Twain for weeks afterward. There was nothing on Henry's chest. No flowers, no personal items, nothing. The coffin was surrounded by mourners, but there was something missing, something that should have been there but wasn't. Twain said he woke up sobbing uncontrollably, and the grief felt absolutely real. For several minutes, he wasn't sure if he was still dreaming or if Henry had actually died. The emotions were so intense that he had to physically get up and check on Henry, who was sleeping peacefully in the next room. But even seeing his brother alive and breathing didn't completely shake the feeling that something terrible was going to happen. Now, you have to understand that Twain was a rational, skeptical person who made his living observing human nature and calling out superstition and nonsense. He wasn't prone to mystical thinking or believing in omens. But this dream was so vivid, so emotionally real, that it stuck with him in a way that worried him. He almost told Henry about it several times, but decided against it because, well, how do you tell your brother you dreamed about his funeral without sounding completely insane? 3 weeks later, on June 13, 1858, Henry's steamboat, the Pennsylvania, exploded on the Mississippi River near Memphis. It was one of the worst steamboat disasters in the river's history. The boilers exploded. The ship caught fire and many crew members were killed instantly. Henry wasn't killed immediately, though. He was thrown into the river by the explosion, rescued, and taken to a makeshift hospital in Memphis with severe internal injuries from the blast. Twain rushed to Memphis as soon as he heard about the accident, and when he arrived at the hospital, he found Henry unconscious but still alive. The doctor said his injuries were too severe. He had internal bleeding and burns that couldn't be treated effectively with 1858 medical technology. He died 2 days later, never regaining consciousness, looking exactly as peaceful as he had in Twain's dream. When Twain arrived at his sister's house in St. Louis for the funeral, he walked into the living room and stopped dead in his tracks. Everything was exactly as he had dreamed it, the furniture rearranged for a funeral, mourners gathered around, and Henry lying in a metallic coffin. The metal coffin was unusual. The ladies of Memphis had felt so sorry for the young man, who died helping other passengers, that they had donated money for a better coffin than the standard wooden one. Henry was wearing one of Twain's suits because his own clothes had been destroyed in the explosion, exactly as Twain had dreamed. And just like in the dream, there was nothing on Henry's chest. No flowers, no personal items, nothing. Twain stood there staring at the scene, probably thinking he was losing his mind. Every detail from his dream had come true except for one thing. There were no flowers on Henry's chest. Then, as Twain watched, an elderly woman he didn't recognize walked over to the coffin. She said Henry looked too young and peaceful to die without something beautiful, and she placed a white rose with a red rose in the center on his chest. Twain later wrote that watching that flower being placed on Henry's chest was the most unsettling moment of his entire life. It meant that every single detail of his dream, even the detail that seemed wrong at first, had been completely accurate. He said it made him question everything he thought he knew about reality, time, death, and the nature of human consciousness. This experience haunted Twain for the rest of his life. He became fascinated with psychic phenomena, attended seances, and wrote extensively about the possibility that human consciousness could access information beyond normal sensory experience. He said that after Henry's death, he could never dismiss dreams or intuitions the way he had before, because he'd learned that sometimes our sleeping minds know things our waking minds couldn't possibly know. The really disturbing thing about Twain's experience is that he could have potentially prevented the tragedy. If he'd taken the dream seriously, if he'd convinced Henry not to work on that particular steamboat trip, maybe his brother would have lived. But then again, maybe Henry would have died some other way, some other time. Maybe dreams like this aren't warnings meant to change the future. Maybe they're just glimpses of what's already been written somewhere, in the cosmic script we can't normally read. What I find most fascinating about Twain's story is how it changed him from a skeptic into someone who believed that consciousness operates according to rules we don't understand. He went from making fun of people who believed in supernatural phenomena to acknowledging that the human mind might be capable of things that science couldn't explain. Speaking of unexplained abilities of the human mind, there's another story that's even more disturbing because it involves not just one person having a prophetic dream, but multiple people having the same prophetic nightmare about the same disaster, as if the future was somehow broadcasting its intentions to anyone who was tuned into the right frequency. This one's going to sound absolutely unbelievable, but it's documented in multiple sources and witnessed by dozens of people. In the weeks leading up to the Titanic's maiden voyage in April 1912, at least 19 different people, and these are just the documented cases, had specific, detailed dreams about the ship sinking. Not just generic something bad will happen dreams, but precise nightmares about icebergs, freezing water, inadequate lifeboats, and thousands of people dying in the North Atlantic. Now, you have to understand the context here. The Titanic was being promoted as unsinkable by the White Star Line. It was the largest, most luxurious ship ever built with revolutionary safety features and backup systems. The idea that this technological marvel could sink on its first voyage was literally unthinkable to most people. So, when individuals started having dreams about this supposedly impossible disaster, it wasn't based on any realistic fear or logical concern. One of the most detailed cases involved a businessman named J. Cunnon Middleton, who had booked first-class passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage. Starting in March 1912, about 3 weeks before the sailing date, Middleton began having the same nightmare repeatedly. In his dream, he saw the Titanic floating upside down in freezing water, with passengers struggling to survive in the ocean while lifeboats that were only half full rowed away from the screaming. But here's what made Middleton's dream particularly chilling. He saw specific details about how the ship would sink. He dreamed that it would hit an iceberg late at night, that the impact would cause flooding in multiple compartments, and that the ship would slowly tilt forward before breaking apart. He even dreamed about the exact sound the ship would make as it went under, a groaning, metallic screech that he said was unlike anything he'd ever heard. Middleton was so disturbed by these recurring nightmares that he went to the White Star Line office and tried to cancel his passage. When they refused to refund his money, he literally walked away from the substantial sum he'd paid, which was a lot of money in 1912, rather than board the ship. His family thought he was having a nervous breakdown. His business partners were furious that he was missing important meetings in New York. But Middleton said the dreams felt more real than his waking life, and he couldn't bring himself to ignore them. Another documented case involved Mrs. Jack Marshall and her husband, who had also booked passage on the Titanic. Mrs. Marshall started having nightmares about drowning in icy water while wearing her best evening dress, the one she'd packed specifically for the ship's elegant dinner parties. In her dream, she and her husband were separated in the chaos, and she watched him disappear under the water. While she struggled to stay afloat in a sea filled with screaming passengers, Mrs. Marshall was so terrified by these dreams that she begged her husband to cancel their trip. When he refused, calling it women's nonsense and insisting they couldn't miss the social event of the decade, she took matters into her own hands. On the morning they were supposed to depart for Southampton, she hid all of her husband's clothes and refused to tell him where they were until after the ship had sailed. They had a massive fight about it. Mr. Marshall was furious about missing the voyage and potentially damaging his business relationships. But Mrs. Marshall said later that she would rather deal with her husband's anger than watch him drown in her dreams every night. As it turned out, her irrational behavior saved both their lives. But not everyone who had these prophetic dreams was able to act on them. Several passengers who actually boarded the Titanic reported having disturbing nightmares during the voyage itself. Mrs. Roberta Mahoney told other passengers about recurring dreams where she couldn't find her children in dark, freezing water. She described seeing the ship's lights disappearing beneath the waves while families were separated in the chaos. A businessman named William Stead, who was traveling to New York for a peace conference, told dinner companions about a dream where he saw himself helping women and children into lifeboats before going down with the ship. Stead was known for his interest in spiritualism and psychic phenomena, so other passengers listened to his dream with interest rather than dismissing it as anxiety. But perhaps the most eerily accurate prophetic dream came from someone who wasn't even on the ship, Morgan Robertson, a largely unknown writer who in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic sailed, wrote a novel called Futility about a supposedly unsinkable ship called the Titan that hits an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sinks with massive loss of life. The similarities between Robertson's fictional ship and the real Titanic are so numerous and specific that they seem almost supernatural. Both ships were the largest vessels of their time. Both were called unsinkable. Both were traveling from England to New York when they hit icebergs. Both sank in April in the North Atlantic, and both had insufficient lifeboats for all passengers. Even the names were almost identical, Titan and Titanic. But here's what makes Robertson's story absolutely spine-chilling. He claimed the novel came to him entirely through dreams. He said he would have recurring nightmares about being on this massive ship, feeling it shake violently, hearing the sound of metal tearing apart, and watching it disappear beneath dark water while people screamed for help. When people asked him how he came up with such specific technical details about ship construction and maritime disasters, he said, "I didn't come up with them. I just wrote down what I dreamed." What makes the Titanic dreams phenomenon so disturbing is the sheer number of people who experience them. We're not talking about one or two individuals having vague premonitions. We're talking about dozens of documented cases of people having specific, detailed dreams about the same disaster before it happened. Some were potential passengers who changed their minds, some were people who had no connection to the ship at all, and some were passengers who sailed despite their nightmares. After the Titanic sank, researchers and journalists began documenting these prophetic dreams, and the pattern was undeniable. Multiple people had dreamed about icebergs, freezing water, inadequate lifeboats, and the specific way the ship would break apart before sinking. Many had dreamed about the exact time of night the disaster would occur, just before midnight, and the fact that it would happen on a clear, calm night when the lack of waves would make it harder to spot icebergs. Some researchers have theorized that major disasters create what they call temporal ripples events so significant that they somehow broadcast backward through time, appearing in the dreams of sensitive individuals before they actually happen. The Titanic disaster, which killed over 1,500 people and marked the end of an era of blind faith in technology, certainly qualifies as the kind of event that might create such ripples. The really unsettling question is, how many disasters could be prevented if we paid more attention to collective dreaming patterns? If multiple people are having similar nightmares about specific future events, maybe that's information we should take seriously rather than dismissing as coincidence or anxiety. Or maybe it's more disturbing than that. Maybe some events are so significant, so inevitable that they send warnings backward through time, appearing in dreams long before they actually happen. Maybe the future isn't as fixed as we think, or maybe our consciousness isn't as limited to the present moment as we assume. Either way, the Titanic dreams remain one of the most documented cases of collective prophetic dreaming in modern history, and they raise questions about the nature of time, consciousness, and fate that we still can't answer more than a century later. Speaking of historical figures who seem to have an uncomfortably accurate connection to future events, there's another story about someone whose prophetic dreams were so detailed and precise that they essentially provided him with a script for his own death, a script that played out exactly as dreamed, even though he tried to change the ending. Grigory Rasputin, the infamous Russian mystic who wielded incredible influence over the Romanov royal family, had prophetic dreams about his own death that were so detailed and accurate it's almost like he received a step-by-step instruction manual for his own murder. But what makes this story absolutely fascinating and deeply disturbing is that Rasputin not only dreamed about how he would die, but also about the catastrophic consequences his death would have for Imperial Russia. Now, to understand why Rasputin's prophetic dreams are so significant, you need to know that this wasn't just some random peasant claiming to have visions. Rasputin had built his entire reputation on his ability to predict future events and heal people through what he claimed were divine revelations. The Russian royal family trusted him completely because his predictions had proven accurate. So many times before he'd predicted military defeats, political upheavals, and even specific dates when the young Prince Alexei would have life-threatening hemophilia attacks. Starting in November 1916, about a month before his actual assassination, Rasputin began having incredibly vivid dreams about his own murder. But these weren't vague nightmares about danger or violence. They were like watching a detailed documentary of events that hadn't happened yet. He saw himself being lured to a basement room in an elegant mansion by people he trusted, people who smiled at him while planning his death. In his dreams, Rasputin saw himself eating cakes and drinking wine that had been poisoned with cyanide. But here's where the dream gets specific and historically accurate. He saw himself not dying from the poison. Much to his murderer's frustration and horror, he dreamed about the confused, panicked looks on their faces when the poison didn't work as quickly as they'd expected, and their growing desperation as they realized they would have to find another way to kill him. Rasputin told several people that in his dream, when the poison failed, his attackers would shoot him. But even more disturbing, he saw himself surviving the first shooting, getting back up and trying to escape. He dreamed about crawling through snow in a courtyard, bleeding and desperate, while his murderers chased him down and shot him again. And still, in the dream, he wouldn't die easily. The final detail of Rasputin's death dream was perhaps the most chilling. He saw himself being tied up and thrown into the frozen Neva River while still alive. He dreamed about sinking beneath the ice, struggling against the ropes, and finally drowning in the dark, freezing water. He said he could feel the cold water filling his lungs and see the lights of St. Petersburg growing dimmer as he sank deeper. But what made Rasputin's dreams truly prophetic wasn't just the method of his death. It was his identification of the people who would kill him and the exact location where it would happen. He specifically named Prince Felix Yusupov as the leader of the conspiracy, describing him as a beautiful young man with the soul of a killer. He also saw Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich and a British agent participating in the murder. Even more remarkably, Rasputin described the basement room where he would be killed in precise detail. Elegant furniture, oriental rugs, a fireplace, and religious icons on the walls. He had never been to Yusupov's palace, but his description of the basement room where the murder would take place was completely accurate. Here's where this story becomes almost unbelievable. Rasputin actually told Yusupov directly about his dreams. In December 1916, just weeks before his death, Rasputin looked the prince in the eye and said, "I have seen you kill me in a basement room with fancy carpets. I have watched you poison me, shoot me, and throw me into the river. But I have also seen what will happen to Russia after I die." Because Rasputin's death dreams weren't just about his own murder. They were part of a larger vision about the fall of Imperial Russia. He told Tsar Nicholas II that if he, Rasputin, died at the hands of nobles, the entire Romanov dynasty would fall within 2 years. He said he saw the royal family imprisoned, executed, and their bodies thrown into a pit. He predicted revolution, civil war, and the rise of a new form of government that would be worse than anything Russia had ever experienced. When Prince Yusupov and his co-conspirators actually murdered Rasputin on December 17, 1916, everything played out exactly as he had dreamed. They lured him to Yusupov's palace basement with the promise of meeting the prince's beautiful wife. They fed him cakes and wine laced with enough cyanide to kill several men. When the poison didn't work fast enough, they shot him. When he still didn't die, they shot him again. When he tried to escape, they chased him down and beat him unconscious. Finally, they tied him up and threw him into the frozen Neva River, where he drowned. The most chilling confirmation of Rasputin's prophetic dreams came from the autopsy. The coroner found water in Rasputin's lungs, proving that he had still been alive when thrown into the river, exactly as he had dreamed. His hands were found untied, indicating that he had managed to free himself underwater and had tried desperately to escape from beneath the ice, just as he had described in his visions. And Rasputin's predictions about Russia's future proved equally accurate. The Romanov dynasty fell in March 1917, just 3 months after his death. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and within 18 months the entire royal family was murdered by Bolsheviks and their bodies thrown into a pit, exactly as Rasputin had predicted. The Russian Revolution led to civil war, famine, and the establishment of a communist dictatorship that would last for over 70 years. What I find most disturbing about Rasputin's story is the paradox of prophetic knowledge. He knew exactly how he would die, who would kill him, and what the consequences would be, but this knowledge didn't save him, if anything. It seemed to ensure that events unfolded exactly as he had foreseen. When he told Yusupov about the dreams, he essentially provided his murderer with a detailed plan, as if the future was using Rasputin himself to guarantee its own fulfillment. It raises profound questions about fate, free will, and the nature of prophetic dreams. If you can see your own death in precise detail, do you have the power to change it? Or are you just a witness to events that have already been written? Rasputin seemed to believe that some futures are inevitable, and that prophetic dreams aren't warnings meant to prevent disasters. They're preparations for tragedies that cannot be avoided. The idea that some people can accurately predict not just personal tragedies, but natural disasters brings us to our final story about prophetic dreams. One that involves an ordinary person having an extraordinarily specific vision of one of the most devastating earthquakes in American history, complete with details that couldn't possibly have been known through any normal means. On the night of April 17, 1906, exactly 1 day before the Great San Francisco earthquake that would destroy most of the city and kill over 3,000 people, a hotel clerk named Henry Morse had the most vivid, terrifying nightmare of his entire life. But calling it a nightmare doesn't really do justice to what Morse experienced. It was more like being transported forward in time to witness a natural disaster with documentary-level precision, complete with specific buildings collapsing, exact locations of fires, and even the approximate time of day when the catastrophe would strike. Henry Morse was not someone given to flights of fancy or mystical thinking. He was a practical, methodical man who worked the night shift at the Palace Hotel, one of San Francisco's most prestigious establishments. He'd lived in the city for over a decade, knew its buildings and neighborhoods intimately, and had never experienced anything like prophetic dreams before. He was the kind of person who believed in hard work, common sense, and scientific explanations for unusual events. But on that April night, Morse experienced something that challenged everything he thought. He knew about the relationship between sleeping minds and future reality. In his dream, he was standing on Market Street in downtown San Francisco when the ground began to shake violently. But this wasn't just generic earthquake imagery. Morse saw specific buildings responding to the seismic waves in precise detail. He watched the Palace Hotel, where he worked every day, swaying dangerously before parts of its facade began crashing onto the street below. He saw the City Hall building, with its impressive dome, completely collapse into a pile of rubble that blocked several streets. He witnessed the massive brick buildings in the financial district cracking and crumbling, their walls falling outward in patterns that he would later recognize as exactly matching the real earthquake's damage. But what made Morse's dream truly remarkable was its incredible specificity about which parts of the city would be most affected. He saw that the areas built on landfill, particularly the south of Market District, would suffer the worst damage, with buildings sinking into the unstable ground. He dreamed about specific structures that would survive relatively intact, like certain steel frame buildings that had been constructed with newer engineering techniques. Morse also saw something in his dream that seemed impossible at the time: fires, starting almost immediately after the earthquake and spreading rapidly throughout the city. He watched flames erupting from broken gas mains, saw electrical wires sparking and igniting wooden buildings, and witnessed the fires spreading faster than emergency responders could contain them. In 1906, the idea that fires would be more destructive than the earthquake itself seemed counterintuitive, but that's exactly what happened. One of the most specific and troubling details in Morse's dream was his vision of the city's water system failing completely. He saw water mains breaking underground, fire hydrants producing only a trickle of water, and firefighters desperately trying to battle massive blazes with inadequate water pressure. He dreamed about fire departments being forced to create fire breaks by dynamiting buildings, a desperate tactic that actually happened during the real disaster. In his dream, Morse watched firefighters and citizens working together to dynamite entire city blocks to prevent fires from spreading, something that seemed so extreme and unlikely that he almost dismissed the entire dream as fantasy. But dynamiting buildings to create fire breaks was exactly the strategy that San Francisco's fire department used during the actual earthquake. Morse's dream also included remarkably accurate predictions about human behavior during the disaster. He saw thousands of people fleeing their homes with whatever possessions they could carry, setting up temporary camps in Golden Gate Park and other large open spaces. He dreamed about families being separated in the chaos, people searching frantically for missing relatives, and entire neighborhoods of refugees camping outdoors for days because their homes had been destroyed. He even saw specific details about how people would adapt to the emergency, cooking meals over open fires in the streets, sharing resources with strangers, and organizing themselves into informal communities to survive until official help could arrive. These behavioral predictions proved to be completely accurate during the actual disaster. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Morse's dream was its precision about timing. He dreamed that the earthquake would strike tomorrow morning when the sun is just coming up, and the great San Francisco earthquake hit at 5:12 a.m. on April 18th, just as dawn was breaking over the city. The specificity of this timing prediction is extraordinary, considering that earthquakes are essentially impossible to predict with such accuracy even with modern seismological equipment. When Morse woke up from this dream, he was so disturbed and the images were so vivid that he immediately wrote down everything he could remember. He told his wife about the dream in detail, describing specific buildings that would collapse and areas of the city that would burn. He also shared the dream with his supervisor at the Palace Hotel and several regular guests, telling them about his vision of the hotel's facade crashing onto Market Street. Most people who heard about Morse's dream were politely skeptical. A few suggested he might be working too many night shifts and should get more rest. But Morse insisted that this dream felt completely different from any he'd ever experienced, more like a memory of something that had already happened than a fantasy his mind had created. 24 hours later, at exactly the time Morse had predicted, the great San Francisco earthquake struck with devastating force. The 7.9 magnitude quake lasted for nearly a minute and was felt from Los Angeles to Oregon. And every single detail from Morse's dream came true with documentary accuracy. The Palace Hotel's facade did collapse onto Market Street, exactly as he had seen. City Hall was completely destroyed, its dome crashing down and blocking traffic for weeks. The financial district suffered massive damage, with brick buildings collapsing in the precise patterns Morse had described. The south of Market area, built on unstable landfill, experienced the worst destruction as buildings sank into the liquefied ground. The fires that Morse had seen in his dream proved to be more destructive than the earthquake itself. Broken gas mains ignited immediately, electrical systems sparked fires throughout the city, and the blazes spread so rapidly that they eventually consumed over 28,000 buildings. The water system failed exactly as Morse had dreamed, with broken mains leaving firefighters helpless against the advancing flames. San Francisco's fire department was forced to use dynamite to create fire breaks, demolishing entire blocks of buildings to prevent the fires from spreading further. The extreme measure that had seemed so unlikely when Morse described it in his dream. Golden Gate Park did become a massive refugee camp, housing thousands of displaced residents exactly as he had envisioned. The most psychologically disturbing aspect of Morse's experience was having to live through his own prophetic dream. He later said that watching the disaster unfold was more terrifying than experiencing an earthquake because he knew what was going to happen next at every moment. He described it as being trapped in a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from, except this time he was already awake. Morse spent the day after the earthquake helping rescue people from collapsed buildings and fighting fires, but he said the experience of living through events he'd already witnessed in his dream was profoundly disorienting. It challenged his fundamental understanding of time, consciousness, and reality in ways that affected him for the rest of his life. After the disaster, when people realized how accurate Morse's dream had been, he became something of a local celebrity. Newspapers interviewed him about his prophetic experience, and researchers came to study his case. But Morse said the attention made him uncomfortable because he couldn't explain how or why he'd been able to see future events with such precision. He spent years trying to understand what had happened to him that night, reading about dreams, consciousness, and precognition. But he never experienced another prophetic dream, as if his brain had temporarily accessed some kind of information that was normally unavailable to human consciousness. Morse's story raises profound questions about the nature of prophetic dreams and their relationship to natural disasters. Some researchers have theorized that sensitive individuals might be able to detect subtle environmental changes that precede major seismic events. Changes that the conscious mind doesn't notice, but that the unconscious mind processes during sleep. But even this theory doesn't explain the incredible specificity of Morse's dream or his accurate predictions about human behavior, fire patterns, and the failure of the city's infrastructure. His dream seems to have involved accessing information about the future that couldn't have been available through any normal sensory or cognitive process. What I find most fascinating about Henry Morse's story is how it demonstrates that prophetic dreams can involve not just personal tragedies or individual deaths, but massive natural disasters that affect entire cities. It suggests that the relationship between consciousness and time might be more complex and mysterious than our current scientific understanding allows. Maybe some events are so significant that they create what we might call temporal echoes, reverberations that travel backward through time, appearing in the dreams of individuals who are somehow tuned in to frequencies that most of us can't detect. Or maybe consciousness itself operates according to principles we haven't discovered yet. Principles that occasionally allow sleeping minds to glimpse the future with startling accuracy. Either way, Morse's prophetic dream about the San Francisco earthquake remains one of the most documented and detailed cases of disaster prediction in modern history, and it continues to challenge our basic assumptions about the boundaries of human awareness and the nature of time itself. But it's not just famous historical figures who experience prophetic dreams. Sometimes ordinary people have extraordinary glimpses of the future that are just as accurate and just as disturbing. And what makes these stories even more fascinating is how they show us that prophetic dreams aren't reserved for emperors and presidents. They can happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time. In 1966, a woman named Premonition Williams, yes, that was actually her name, which is either cosmic irony or destiny working in the most obvious way possible, lived in the small Welsh mining village of Aberfan. For 3 consecutive nights, she had the same horrific dream about the local coal mine that dominated their community's landscape and livelihood. Now, Premonition wasn't some eccentric fortune teller or mystical village wise woman. She was a practical mother of 4 who worked part-time at the local bakery and spent her days worrying about normal things like getting her children to school on time and making sure there was enough money for groceries. She'd lived in Aberfan her entire life, watching generations of men descend into the coal mines every morning and emerge black with dust every evening. The coal waste tip that loomed above their village had been there for as long as anyone could remember, a massive, artificial mountain of mining debris that grew larger every year as trucks dumped more and more waste material onto the pile. Everyone in the village was so accustomed to it that they barely noticed it anymore. It was just part of the landscape, like the mountains and the valley itself. But in Premonition's dream, this familiar landmark became an instrument of unimaginable destruction. She saw the entire waste pile suddenly becoming unstable, liquefying like a massive black river, and sliding down the mountainside with unstoppable force. The sound in her dream was what haunted her most, a low, rumbling roar that grew louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. In the dream, she watched this black avalanche of coal waste and mud flowing directly toward the village school where her own daughter and hundreds of other children spent their days. She could see the building clearly in her nightmare, the red brick walls, the windows where children's artwork was displayed, the playground where kids played during recess, and she watched in horror as this massive wave of black sludge completely engulfed the entire school. The details in her dream were so specific they felt like memories rather than imagination. She saw children trapped under the black mud, heard their screams echoing from beneath tons of coal waste, and watched parents running frantically toward the school, clawing at the debris with their bare hands, trying desperately to reach their children. She could smell the coal dust in the air, thick and choking, making it hard to breathe. She could feel the wet, heavy texture of the mud between her fingers as she dug alongside other parents. But perhaps the most disturbing detail in Premonition's recurring nightmare was her ability to see specific faces of children who would be trapped. She dreamed about little Mary Henderson from down the street, about the twins who lived next to the post office, about her daughter's best friend who always had pigtails tied with blue ribbons. These weren't vague, shadowy figures, they were real children she knew personally. And in her dream, she watched each of them disappear under the black tide. When Premonition woke up from these dreams, she was always sobbing and covered in sweat. The emotions felt absolutely real. The grief, the panic, the desperation of trying to save children who were beyond rescue. Her husband would find her sitting on the edge of their bed, shaking and crying, trying to convince herself that it had only been a nightmare. But after 3 nights of the same dream, Premonition decided she couldn't ignore it anymore. She got dressed early one morning and walked to the mine office, where she asked to speak with the foreman about her concerns regarding the waste tip's stability. When she explained that she'd been having dreams about the tip sliding down and burying the school, the foreman looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "Mrs. Williams," he said, barely hiding his condescension, "that tip has been there for decades. It's perfectly stable. You don't need to worry yourself about engineering matters that you don't understand." He essentially patted her on the head and told her not to concern herself with man's work, because clearly a woman's dreams about industrial disasters couldn't possibly be relevant to actual industrial safety. Premonition tried explaining the specificity of her dreams, the details she'd seen, the overwhelming sense of urgency she felt, but the foreman dismissed her concerns entirely, suggesting that she was probably just anxious because her daughter attended the school and maybe she should speak to her doctor about her nerves instead of bothering busy men with women's hysteria. Frustrated but not defeated, Premonition went to the school principal and tried to convince him to evacuate the building, or at least move the children to a different location for a few days. She explained about her dreams, about the danger she'd seen coming, about her absolute certainty that something terrible was about to happen. The principal was more polite than the mine foreman, but equally dismissive. He thanked her for her concern, but explained that they couldn't disrupt hundreds of children's education based on someone's nightmares. She even tried talking to other parents, hoping that if enough people demanded action, someone in authority would listen. But most parents were sympathetic yet skeptical. They understood a mother's worry, but moving an entire school based on dreams seemed extreme and irrational. A few parents did express concerns about the waste tip's size and proximity to the village, but not enough to create any organized pressure for action. 5 days later, on October 21st, 1966, everything Premonition had dreamed came true with horrifying precision. A section of the coal waste tip became saturated with water from underground springs and recent heavy rains. At exactly 9:15 a.m., just as children were settling into their morning lessons, the waste pile liquefied and began sliding down the mountainside like a massive black avalanche. The coal waste landslide moved at incredible speed, gathering momentum and volume as it descended toward the village. It hit Panglass Junior School with devastating force, completely burying the building under tons of black sludge in a matter of minutes. The sound was exactly as Premonition had heard in her dreams, a low, terrifying roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. 144 people died in the Aberfan disaster, including 116 children between the ages of 7 and 10. The entire village was transformed in minutes from a quiet mining community into a scene of unimaginable tragedy. Parents ran toward the school just as Premonition had seen in her dreams, digging frantically with their hands, shovels, anything they could find, trying to reach their children buried under the coal waste. The details that Premonition had dreamed about proved to be chillingly accurate. The specific children she'd seen in her nightmares were among those who died. The way the disaster unfolded, the sounds, the chaos, the desperate rescue efforts, everything matched her visions with documentary precision. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this story is that Premonition's own daughter was at Panglass Junior School that morning. The little girl survived, but barely. She was pulled from the debris after hours of digging, injured but alive. Premonition spent the rest of her life wondering if she could have been more persuasive, if she could have somehow convinced the authorities to take her dreams seriously, if she could have prevented the tragedy by finding the right words or the right person to listen to her warnings. What makes this story even more disturbing is that Premonition Williams wasn't the only person who had prophetic dreams about the Aberfan disaster. After the tragedy, investigators discovered that at least 12 other people in the area had reported similar dreams or premonitions about the coal mine in the weeks leading up to the landslide. 12 different individuals sensed something terrible was coming, and not a single person in authority listened to any of them. There was Mrs. Sybil Brown, who dreamed about children running and screaming while black water chased them. There was David Davies, who had nightmares about the village being buried under a black wave. There was even a 10-year-old girl named Errol Mai Jones who told her mother the day before the disaster, "I'm not afraid to die. I'll be with Peter and June, 2 school friends." The next day, all 3 children died together in the landslide. The Aberfan disaster became a turning point in how seriously officials take community concerns about industrial safety. But it also stands as one of the most documented cases of collective prophetic dreaming about a specific disaster. Multiple people sensed the same tragedy coming, had similar visions of destruction, and tried in their own ways to warn others about the danger they perceived. Premonition Williams lived until 1981, and she spent those 15 years carrying the weight of knowing that her dreams had been accurate warnings that went unheeded. She became an advocate for taking prophetic dreams and community premonitions more seriously, especially when they involve public safety. She often said that if the men in charge had listened to the women who were having these dreams, 116 children might still be alive today. Captain David Hobb was a commercial airline pilot who'd been flying for 15 years without a single serious incident. He was known among his colleagues as Steady Dave, the kind of pilot who followed every safety protocol to the letter, who never took risks, and who had an almost supernatural ability to sense potential problems with aircraft before they became serious issues. In October 1978, Hobb was working for Pacific Southwest Airlines, flying regular routes up and down the California coast. He'd logged thousands of hours in various aircraft and prided himself on his professional competence and safety record. Flying wasn't just his job, it was his passion, and he genuinely loved everything about aviation, from the technical aspects of aircraft systems to the simple joy of being airborne. But starting on October 15th, something changed. Hobb began having the same nightmare every single night for a week, and it was unlike any dream he'd ever experienced. In the dream, he was piloting a specific aircraft, tail number N739PA, a Boeing 727 that he'd seen on the tarmac but had never actually flown. The dream always started the same way. He was in the cockpit, going through his normal pre-flight checklist, everything seeming routine and normal. But as the dream progressed, Hobb would feel an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to come from nowhere. In the nightmare, he would taxi the aircraft to the runway, receive clearance for takeoff, and begin the acceleration down the runway. Everything would proceed normally until the moment of rotation, the critical point where the aircraft lifts off from the ground. In his dream, as soon as the wheels left the tarmac, something would go catastrophically wrong. He would hear a sound that he described as like someone ripping apart the world's largest piece of fabric, a tearing, grinding noise that seemed to come from deep within the aircraft's structure. The plane would immediately begin losing power, the engines would start failing in a specific sequence, and he would realize with growing horror that the aircraft wasn't going to clear the obstacles at the end of the runway. The dream was incredibly detailed and technical. Hobb could see specific instrument readings, hear exact alarm sounds, and feel the aircraft's response to his control inputs. He dreamed about trying every emergency procedure he knew, attempting to maintain altitude, calculating whether he had enough speed and lift to clear the buildings beyond the runway. And every time, the dream ended the same way, with the aircraft hitting obstacles at the end of the runway, catching fire, and everyone on board dying in the crash. What made these dreams particularly disturbing for Hobb was their technical accuracy. He wasn't dreaming about generic airplane crashes or vague aviation disasters. He was experiencing specific mechanical failures, exact instrument readings, and precise aircraft behavior that corresponded to real emergency scenarios he'd trained for but never actually encountered. It was as if his subconscious mind was running incredibly detailed flight simulations of a very specific disaster. After having this same nightmare for 3 consecutive nights, Hobb went to his supervisor and requested not to be assigned to aircraft N739PA. He explained that he was having disturbing dreams about that particular plane and felt it would be better for everyone if he flew different aircraft until whatever was causing his anxiety resolved itself. His supervisor, Captain Morrison, was initially sympathetic. Pilots sometimes develop temporary psychological associations with specific aircraft, and the company had policies for accommodating these situations. But when Hobb continued having the dreams and continued requesting to avoid N739PA, Morrison became concerned that his pilot was having some kind of psychological breakdown. "Dave," Morrison said during their second meeting, "you can't avoid specific aircraft because of nightmares. If word gets out that one of our senior pilots is afraid to fly certain planes because of dreams, it could damage confidence in our entire operation. You need to either overcome this phobia or consider whether you're still fit for duty." Hobb tried to explain that this wasn't about fear or phobia. It was about a specific, recurring vision of a specific disaster involving a specific aircraft. He described the technical details of the engine failures he dreamed about, the exact sequence of events, and the specific environmental conditions that would lead to the crash. But to Morrison, this level of detail made Hobb's delusion seem even more serious and concerning. The situation escalated when Hobb's dreams began affecting his performance on other flights. He would find himself checking and double-checking systems that were functioning normally, looking for signs of the engine problems he dreamed about, and generally being more nervous and hypervigilant than usual. Other crew members noticed his changed behavior and began asking questions. Morrison finally gave Hobb an ultimatum: either accept assignment to any aircraft the company designated, including N739PA, or face suspension pending psychological evaluation. Hobb was trapped between his professional responsibilities and his overwhelming conviction that something terrible was going to happen to that specific airplane. So Hobb made a decision that probably saved his life. He stopped talking about the dreams publicly, but he quietly checked the flight schedules every day and made sure through trading shifts and calling in favors that he was never rostered to fly N739PA. He told his wife about the situation, and she supported his decision to trust his instincts, even if it seemed irrational to others. For 2 weeks, Hobb managed to avoid being assigned to the aircraft while continuing to perform his other duties normally. He hoped that the dreams would eventually stop and the whole situation would resolve itself. But the nightmares continued every single night, always featuring the same aircraft, the same mechanical failures, and the same tragic outcome. On November 25, 1978, PSA Flight 182 operating aircraft N739PA crashed during takeoff from San Diego International Airport. The cause was exactly what Hobb had dreamed about: catastrophic engine failure during the critical phase of takeoff, leading to loss of power and inability to clear obstacles at the end of the runway. All 144 people on board died when the aircraft hit a residential area and caught fire. The crash investigation revealed that the engine failure had been caused by a manufacturing defect that hadn't been detected during routine maintenance inspections. The specific sequence of mechanical failures, the aircraft's response characteristics, and even the environmental conditions during the crash matched Hobb's dreams with remarkable accuracy. When Hobb heard about the crash, he didn't feel vindicated or relieved that his premonitions had been correct. Instead, he felt a profound sense of grief and guilt. He wondered if there was something more he could have done, some way he could have convinced the authorities to ground the aircraft or inspect it more thoroughly. He questioned whether his dreams had been a warning that was meant to save lives, not just his own. The psychological impact of this experience on Hobb was devastating. He had predicted a specific disaster with incredible accuracy, but he hadn't been able to prevent it. The weight of knowing that 144 people had died in exactly the way he'd foreseen, while he had remained safe by trusting his premonitions, was almost unbearable. Hobb tried to return to flying after the crash, but he found that he couldn't trust his own judgment anymore. Every unusual sound, every minor instrument fluctuation, every slight deviation from normal procedures would trigger anxiety about whether he was experiencing another prophetic dream or just normal flight operations. He began second-guessing his professional instincts and constantly worried that he might be overlooking real warnings while dismissing phantom concerns. 6 months after the crash, Hobb voluntarily grounded himself and left commercial aviation. He said he could no longer differentiate between legitimate safety concerns and anxiety-induced paranoia. The experience of having accurate prophetic dreams had paradoxically made him less confident in his ability to assess real-world situations rationally. Hobb spent years in therapy trying to understand what had happened to him and how his subconscious mind had been able to detect a mechanical problem that maintenance crews and safety inspectors had missed. His therapist suggested that his extensive experience with aircraft systems might have allowed him to unconsciously process subtle cues about the plane's condition that his conscious mind couldn't identify. But this rational explanation didn't fully account for the specificity and accuracy of Hobb's dreams, or for the fact that he'd never actually flown the aircraft in question. Somehow, his sleeping mind had accessed information about a future disaster that wasn't available through any normal sensory or cognitive process. The David Hobb case became one of the most studied examples of prophetic dreams in aviation psychology. It raised questions about whether pilots with extensive experience might sometimes unconsciously detect safety problems that don't show up in conventional inspections, and whether the aviation industry should take seriously reports of persistent, specific premonitions about aircraft safety. Hobb eventually found peace by becoming a safety consultant for aircraft manufacturers, helping to develop better diagnostic systems for detecting the kind of mechanical problems that had caused the crash of N739PA. He said that if his dreams had served any purpose, it was to help prevent similar disasters in the future by improving aircraft safety protocols. But he never flew as a pilot again, and he never had another prophetic dream. It was as if his subconscious had delivered one crucial warning and then returned to normal function, leaving him to spend the rest of his life wondering why he had been chosen to receive information about a tragedy he couldn't prevent. In 1989, a woman named Sarah Chun was sleeping peacefully in her modest two-bedroom home in Loma Prieta, California, when she experienced what she later described as the most vivid and terrifying dream of her entire life. But calling it a dream doesn't really capture the intensity and realism of what Sarah experienced that night. She said it felt more like being physically transported to a future moment where she was watching her own life unfold in slow motion. Sarah was a practical, no-nonsense mother who worked as a bookkeeper for a local small business while raising her 8-year-old son Tommy as a single parent. She wasn't someone given to mystical thinking or supernatural beliefs. Her world revolved around concrete realities like paying bills on time, helping Tommy with his homework, and making sure they had enough groceries to last until her next paycheck. The Chin family had been living in their small house in the Santa Cruz Mountains for 3 years. It was a modest place, but it was theirs, and Sarah had worked incredibly hard to afford the mortgage payments. Tommy loved the house because his bedroom had built-in bookshelves that reached from floor to ceiling, packed with his growing collection of adventure novels and comic books. Sarah had installed those shelves herself, securing them carefully to the wall studs to make sure they were safe and stable. On the night of October 4th, 1989, Sarah went to bed feeling tired but content after a normal evening of helping Tommy with his math homework and watching a movie together. She fell asleep easily and initially slept peacefully. But sometime around 2 a.m., she found herself in a dream that was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. In the dream, Sarah was standing in her living room when the entire house began shaking violently. But this wasn't like the minor earthquake tremors that were common in California. This was shaking, so intense that she could barely keep her balance. The walls were swaying, the floors were rolling like ocean waves, and she could hear an enormous rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep underground. As the dream continued, Sarah watched in horror as her carefully organized home began falling apart around her. Pictures crashed off the walls, furniture slid across the floor, and windows cracked in spiderweb patterns. But what terrified her most in the dream was the sound coming from Tommy's bedroom, a loud crashing noise followed by her son's voice calling for help. In the nightmare, Sarah ran toward Tommy's room, fighting against the violent shaking that made walking almost impossible. When she reached his doorway, she saw something that would haunt her for weeks afterward. The massive bookshelf that she'd so carefully secured to the wall had somehow broken free and toppled over directly onto Tommy's bed. She could see his small hand reaching out from under the heavy wooden structure, and she could hear his muffled voice calling, "Mommy, help me." The dream was so realistic that Sarah could feel the texture of the wooden shelves as she desperately tried to lift them off her son. She could smell the dust and debris in the air, feel the continued shaking of the house, and hear the sounds of emergency sirens in the distance. She could even see specific details like Tommy's favorite stuffed elephant trapped under the bookshelf and his Spider-Man poster hanging askew on the wall. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the dream was Sarah's inability to move the bookshelf. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how she positioned herself or how much strength she summoned, she couldn't lift the heavy wooden structure enough to free her son. She felt completely helpless and panicked, watching her child in danger and being unable to save him. Sarah woke up from this nightmare gasping and crying, her heart pounding so hard she thought she might be having a heart attack. The emotions felt absolutely real, the terror, the helplessness, the desperate need to protect her child. She immediately got up and checked on Tommy, who was sleeping peacefully in his bed, completely unaware of his mother's distress. Standing in Tommy's doorway, looking at him safe and sound in his bed, Sarah tried to convince herself that it had just been a stress-related nightmare. Single parenthood was challenging, and maybe her subconscious was processing fears about her ability to protect her son. But something about the dream felt different from normal anxiety dreams. It had been too specific, too detailed, and too emotionally realistic. For the next several days, Sarah couldn't shake the images from her dream. Every time she looked at the bookshelf in Tommy's room, She remembered the sound it had made crashing down and the sight of her son trapped beneath it. The memory was so vivid that she began questioning whether the bookshelf was really as secure as she'd thought. Despite feeling somewhat foolish, Sarah decided to take action based on her dream. She told Tommy that she wanted to redecorate his room and moved his bed to the opposite wall, away from the bookshelf. She also went to the hardware store and bought additional brackets to secure the bookshelf even more firmly to the wall studs. When Tommy asked why she was suddenly so concerned about his furniture, she made up a story about reading an article about child safety in the home. Sarah's husband had passed away 2 years earlier, so she didn't have a partner to discuss her concerns with. She considered calling her sister or her mother, but she was embarrassed about basing home safety decisions on a nightmare. Instead, she quietly made changes around the house to address the hazards she'd seen in her dream. In addition to moving Tommy's bed and reinforcing the bookshelf, Sarah also secured other heavy objects throughout the house, installed safety latches on kitchen cabinets, and created an emergency kit with flashlights, water, and first aid supplies. She told herself she was just being a responsible parent, but deep down, she was preparing for the specific disaster she'd experienced in her dream. Her preparations turned out to be prophetic. On October 17, 1989, just 2 weeks after her nightmare, the Loma Prieta earthquake struck Northern California with devastating force. At 5:04 p.m., Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner when the 6.9 magnitude earthquake began shaking the entire Bay Area. The earthquake was exactly as intense and terrifying as Sarah had experienced in her dream. The house shook so violently that she could barely stand, pictures crashed off walls, and furniture slid across the floor just as she'd envisioned. The rumbling sound from underground was identical to what she'd heard in her nightmare, and the duration of the shaking seemed to last forever. When the earthquake finally stopped, Sarah's first thought was of Tommy, who had been in his bedroom doing homework. She ran to his room and found him shaken but unharmed, crouched under his desk just as they'd practiced during school earthquake drills. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was the sight of his former bed location. The massive bookshelf had indeed broken free from the wall and crashed down exactly where his bed used to be. The heavy wooden shelves, despite Sarah's additional reinforcements, had toppled over and smashed into the wall where Tommy's bed had been positioned just 2 weeks earlier. Books, toys, and shelf fragments were scattered across the floor in a pile. That would have seriously injured or killed anyone sleeping in that spot. Tommy looked at the destruction and said, "Mom, I'm so glad you moved my bed. That would have really hurt if I'd been sleeping there." Sarah just hugged her son tightly, overwhelmed with gratitude that her nightmare had prompted her to take action that saved his life. The psychological impact of this experience on Sarah was profound. She had literally dreamed about a specific disaster, taken action to prevent the worst consequences, and then watched her dream come true with remarkable accuracy. It changed her entire understanding of dreams, intuition, and the relationship between consciousness and future events. Sarah became much more attentive to her dreams after the earthquake, keeping a journal by her bed and writing down any dreams that felt particularly vivid or significant. She also encouraged Tommy to pay attention to his own dreams and trust his instincts about potential dangers or important decisions. Years later, Sarah would say that the Loma Prieta earthquake taught her that prophetic dreams might serve as warnings that allow us to take protective action, rather than just showing us tragedies we can't prevent. Unlike many prophetic dream experiences that seem to reveal unchangeable futures, Sarah's nightmare had provided her with information that enabled her to save her son's life. The experience also made Sarah a strong advocate for trusting parental instincts and taking action on safety concerns even when they seemed to be based on irrational fears. She would often tell other parents, "If something in your gut tells you your child is in danger, listen to that feeling. It doesn't matter if it seems silly or paranoid. Trust your instincts and take action." Tommy grew up knowing that his mother's dream had saved his life, and the experience influenced his own relationship with sleep and dreaming. As an adult, he became interested in sleep research and eventually pursued a career in neuroscience, partly motivated by his childhood experience of being saved by his mother's prophetic nightmare. Sarah Chen's story remains one of the most compelling examples of a prophetic dream that not only accurately predicted a future disaster but also provided specific information that allowed the dreamer to prevent the worst consequences. It suggests that sometimes our sleeping minds might access information about future dangers specifically to give us the opportunity to protect ourselves and our loved ones. Margaret Sullivan had been planning her wedding to James Murphy for over a year, and by all accounts it was going to be a beautiful celebration. The couple had chosen St. Mary's Cathedral in downtown Pittsburgh for the ceremony, a magnificent Gothic revival church with soaring ceilings, intricate stained glass windows, and a rich history dating back to the 1870s. Margaret had dreamed of getting married in that church since she was a little girl, and James had happily agreed to her choice of venue. Everything about their wedding plans was perfect. Margaret had found her dream dress, a stunning ivory gown with delicate lace sleeves and a cathedral-length train. The flowers were ordered, the reception hall was booked, and the guest list included 200 of their closest family members and friends. James worked as a construction supervisor, so he was particularly appreciative of the church's architectural beauty and structural elegance. But starting exactly 2 weeks before their wedding date in June 1981, Margaret began having the same terrifying nightmare every single night. The dream always started the same way. She was standing at the back of St. Mary's Cathedral in her beautiful wedding dress, holding her father's arm, ready to walk down the aisle to marry the man she loved. In the dream, everything looked exactly as she had envisioned it during their wedding planning. The church was decorated with white roses and baby's breath. The guests were seated in the polished wooden pews wearing their finest clothes, and James was standing at the altar looking handsome and nervous in his black tuxedo. The organist was playing Pachelbel's Canon in D, and shafts of colored light from the stained glass windows created a magical atmosphere. But as Margaret began her walk down the aisle in the dream, she would start hearing an ominous creaking sound coming from somewhere high above. She would look up at the magnificent wooden ceiling with its elaborate carved beams and Gothic arches, and she would see something that filled her with absolute terror, hairline cracks, beginning to appear in the massive wooden structures that supported the roof. In her nightmare, the creaking would grow louder and more urgent as she continued walking toward the altar. The wedding guests would begin looking up nervously, pointing at the ceiling and whispering anxiously among themselves. But somehow, the ceremony would continue, as if everyone was hoping that ignoring the obvious danger would make it go away. The dream always climaxed at the moment when Margaret and James were exchanging vows. Just as the priest asked if anyone objected to their union, a section of the ancient wooden ceiling would give way with a sound like thunder. Margaret would watch in horror as massive wooden beams, carved stone ornaments, and chunks of plaster crashed down into the center of the church where their guests were seated. In her nightmare, Margaret could see specific people being trapped under the debris. She would see her elderly grandmother disappearing under a fallen beam, her young cousin screaming as stone fragments hit her, and her best friend trying frantically to shield her infant daughter from the falling debris. The beautiful Gothic cathedral would transform into a scene of chaos and destruction in a matter of seconds. The most disturbing part of Margaret's recurring dream was its incredible attention to detail. She could see exactly which section of the ceiling would collapse first, which beams would fall in which directions, and which pews would be hit by the heaviest debris. She could hear the specific sounds of wooden structures breaking, stone hitting wooden pews, and people screaming in terror and pain. After having this same nightmare for 5 consecutive nights, Margaret was exhausted, anxious, and beginning to question her sanity. She tried sleeping pills, chamomile tea, meditation, and even staying up all night to avoid dreaming, but nothing helped. Every time she fell asleep, she would find herself back in that church, watching her wedding day transform into a disaster. Finally, Margaret decided she had to tell James about her dreams. She was terrified that he would think she was having a nervous breakdown or that she was trying to find an excuse to postpone their wedding. But James was surprisingly understanding and supportive when she explained what had been happening. "Maggie," he said, holding her hands and looking directly into her eyes, "I know this sounds crazy, but what if your dreams are trying to tell us something important? I work in construction, and I know that old buildings can have structural problems that aren't obvious to the casual observer. Maybe we should have someone inspect the church. Margaret was relieved that James took her concerns seriously, but when they approached the church administration about their safety concerns, they were met with polite dismissal. Father O'Brien, the elderly priest who was scheduled to perform their ceremony, assured them that St. Mary's Cathedral was structurally sound and had been recently inspected by the diocese. "My dear child," Father O'Brien told Margaret, "you're just experiencing pre-wedding jitters. It's perfectly normal to have anxiety dreams before such an important life event. I've been conducting ceremonies in this church for 30 years, and I can assure you that it's completely safe." The church's wedding coordinator was similarly dismissive, pointing out that they had already paid substantial deposits for the ceremony and reception, sent out invitations, and made arrangements that would be expensive and embarrassing to change. "Hundreds of couples have been married in this church without incident," she said. "You can't cancel your entire wedding because of a bad dream." Margaret's family was divided about what to do. Her mother thought the dreams were just wedding stress and encouraged her to see a doctor about anxiety medication. Her father, who was paying for the wedding, was concerned about the financial implications of changing venues at the last minute. Her sister suggested they could proceed with the wedding but ask guests to sit only in certain sections of the church, away from the area where Margaret had seen the ceiling collapse. But Margaret's grandmother, who had experienced her own share of prophetic dreams throughout her long life, took Margaret's concerns very seriously. "Listen to your dreams, sweetheart," she advised. "Sometimes our sleeping minds know things our waking minds can't understand. If you feel this strongly about danger in that church, you need to trust your instincts." As the wedding date approached, Margaret's dreams became even more vivid and specific. She began seeing additional details about which guests would be injured, where people would try to take shelter, and how long it would take for emergency responders to arrive. The nightmares were so realistic that she would wake up feeling like she had actually lived through the disaster. 3 days before the wedding, Margaret made a desperate decision. She and James drove to St. Mary's Cathedral and asked to meet with a structural engineer who could assess the building's safety. They offered to pay for the inspection themselves, explaining that they needed peace of mind before their wedding day. The engineer they hired, Robert Walsh, was initially skeptical about their concerns. But when he climbed up into the church's ceiling structure to examine the wooden beams, he discovered several serious problems that had been hidden from view. The wooden support beams were showing signs of stress and deterioration, and there were indications that the roof weight distribution had shifted over the years due to settling in the building's foundation. "This is quite concerning," Walsh told Margaret and James after completing his inspection. "While the building isn't in immediate danger of collapse, there are several structural issues that should be addressed before this space is used for large gatherings. I'd recommend postponing any major events until these problems can be properly repaired." Armed with the engineer's report, Margaret and James returned to the church administration and requested that their wedding be moved to a different location. Father O'Brien was initially resistant, arguing that the engineer was being overly cautious, but Walsh's detailed technical report and professional liability concerns eventually convinced the church to temporarily close the cathedral for structural repairs. Margaret and James scrambled to find an alternative venue for their wedding, eventually settling on a beautiful garden location that, while different from their original plans, turned out to be even more perfect for their summer ceremony. Their wedding day was absolutely beautiful, with no structural disasters, ceiling collapses, or injured guests. 6 months later, during renovation work at St. Mary's Cathedral, workers discovered that the structural problems were even more serious than Walsh had initially identified. The wooden ceiling beams had been on the verge of catastrophic failure, and if the building had continued to be used for large gatherings, a collapse would have been nearly inevitable. The church's insurance company estimated that if the ceiling had collapsed during a wedding ceremony with 200 guests, the resulting injuries and fatalities would have been devastating. The exact section of the ceiling that Margaret had seen collapsing in her dreams was identified as the area most likely to fail first. and the pattern of debris that would have resulted from the collapse matched her nightmare visions with remarkable accuracy. Margaret's prophetic dreams had not only saved her own wedding day from tragedy, but had also prevented a disaster that could have injured or killed hundreds of people during future events at the cathedral. Her willingness to trust her dreams, despite social pressure and practical complications, had literally saved lives. The experience completely changed Margaret's perspective on the relationship between dreams and reality. She became fascinated with sleep research and prophetic dreams, eventually writing a book about her experience and corresponding with other people who had similar predictive dreams about disasters. Margaret and James remained happily married, and they often reflected on how a series of terrifying nightmares had led them to a wedding day that was even more beautiful than they had originally planned. Margaret would tell people that sometimes the worst dreams can lead to the best outcomes. If you have the courage to listen to what your subconscious mind is trying to tell you. The St. Mary's Cathedral case became a significant example in architectural safety literature, demonstrating how structural problems in historic buildings can be hidden for years before being detected. Margaret's story is often cited as an example of how taking individual safety concerns seriously, even when they seem to be based on non-rational sources, can prevent serious accidents and save lives. Years later, Margaret would say that her prophetic dreams had taught her that sometimes the most important information comes to us in ways that seem impossible or irrational. She learned to trust her instincts and pay attention to dreams that felt different from normal sleep experiences. And she encouraged others to do the same when their safety or well-being might be at stake. Throughout history, different cultures have had completely different ways of understanding prophetic dreams. And the more you learn about these ancient perspectives, the more you realize that maybe our modern skepticism about dreams and the future isn't necessarily more advanced. It might just be more limited. In ancient Egypt, prophetic dreams were considered direct messages from the gods, and they took this belief so seriously that they built their entire spiritual and political system around it. They had entire temples dedicated to dream interpretation, where people would travel hundreds of miles hoping to receive visions of the future. These weren't just small shrines tucked away in forgotten corners. We're talking about massive temple complexes with dedicated priests, elaborate rituals, and detailed procedures that were passed down through generations. The Egyptians believed that during sleep, the soul could travel through time and space, gathering information that wasn't available to the waking mind. They called this the Ka, the spiritual double that could move freely through different dimensions while the physical body rested. According to their theology, the Ka could visit the realm of the gods, where past, present, and future existed simultaneously, and bring back glimpses of what was to come. They documented thousands of prophetic dreams in hieroglyphics, creating what was essentially the world's first database of precognitive experiences. These weren't casual mentions or folklore, they were official records kept by temple scribes, complete with dates, names, witnesses, and follow-up reports about whether the dreams came true. Many of these records were remarkably accurate, describing everything from military victories and defeats to natural disasters and royal successions. Pharaohs made major political and military decisions based on dreams, both their own and those of their designated dream interpreters. The famous story of Pharaoh's dream about 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows, interpreted by Joseph as 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine, was taken so seriously that it shaped economic policy for 14 years. According to historical records, the prophecy was completely accurate, and Egypt's preparation based on this dream allowed them to survive the famine while neighboring civilizations struggled. But the Egyptians didn't just passively wait for prophetic dreams to happen. They developed sophisticated techniques for inducing them, including sleeping in sacred chambers, fasting, meditation, and consuming specific herbs that were believed to enhance dream visions. They created detailed maps of the afterlife and the realm of the gods, teaching dreamers how to navigate these spiritual dimensions and return with useful information. The process of dream interpretation in ancient Egypt was incredibly complex, involving not just the content of the dream, but also the dreamer's social status, the phase of the moon, the season, and various astrological factors. Priests spent years learning to decode symbolic language, understanding that dreams rarely showed literal future events, but rather used metaphorical imagery that required careful analysis. What's fascinating is how seriously these ancient cultures took the connection between sleep and accessing information from outside normal consciousness. They didn't see prophetic dreams as supernatural or impossible. They saw them as a natural function of human awareness that modern society has somehow forgotten how to use properly. They believed that everyone had the potential for prophetic dreaming, but that it required training, preparation, and spiritual discipline to access reliably. The Greeks had a similar approach, but with more systematic methodology and scientific observation. They believed prophetic dreams came from the god Morpheus, and they developed detailed classification systems for different types of prophetic visions. They distinguished between dreams that showed events exactly as they would happen versus dreams that used symbolic language requiring interpretation. They also categorized dreams by their source. Some came from gods, others from the souls of the dead, and still others from the dreamer's own divine nature. Greek dream temples called Asclepions were basically ancient sleep clinics where people went specifically to receive healing or prophetic dreams. These weren't simple buildings, they were elaborate complexes with purification pools, meditation gardens, libraries containing thousands of recorded dreams, and specialized chambers designed to enhance dreaming. Patients would undergo days of preparation, including fasting, bathing in sacred springs, and studying previous prophetic dreams to understand how divine communication worked. The process at an Asclepion was remarkably sophisticated. Priests would interview patients about their specific questions or concerns, then prescribe individualized preparation rituals. Some people needed to fast for specific periods, others required particular herbs or meditation practices. The goal was to prepare the mind and spirit to receive divine communication during sleep. Many of these interpretations involve specific predictions about health, relationships, and future events that were meticulously documented and later verified. The Greeks kept detailed records of success rates, noting which types of dreams were most likely to be accurate and which interpretation methods produced the best results. Some temples reported accuracy rates of over 80% for certain categories of prophetic dreams. The Greek approach was particularly interesting because they tried to understand the mechanics of how prophetic dreams worked. They theorized that the soul could separate from the body during sleep and travel to the realm of the gods, where it could observe events that hadn't yet manifested in the physical world. They also believed that some individuals were naturally gifted oracles who could access this divine realm more easily than others. Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato wrote extensively about prophetic dreams, trying to understand whether they represented genuine glimpses of the future or were simply the mind's way of processing information it had unconsciously gathered. Even the skeptics acknowledged that some prophetic dreams were too accurate to be explained by coincidence, suggesting that human consciousness might be capable of things that normal waking awareness couldn't accomplish. In ancient China, prophetic dreams were considered so important that the emperor employed official dream interpreters as government advisors, and these positions were among the most prestigious and influential roles in the imperial court. The Chinese developed incredibly sophisticated theories about how time works in dreams, suggesting that consciousness can move freely between past, present, and future during sleep, unbound by the linear constraints that limit waking awareness. They believe that some people are natural time travelers who can access information from any point in the timeline while dreaming. These individuals were highly valued and often became advisors to military leaders and politicians, influencing major battles and political decisions throughout Chinese history. The imperial dream interpreters were required to undergo years of training, studying not just dream symbolism but also astronomy, medicine, psychology, and military strategy. The Chinese theory of dream time was remarkably complex. They believed that during deep sleep, consciousness could access what they called the eternal now, a state where all moments exist simultaneously. From this perspective, the future wasn't something that hadn't happened yet. but rather something that already existed in a different dimension of time. Prophetic dreamers were simply people who could visit this eternal realm and bring back information about events that appeared to be future from the linear perspective of waking consciousness. Many major battles and political decisions in Chinese history were influenced by prophetic dreams. The famous military strategist Sun Tzu wrote about using dream visions to plan battle strategies, and several dynasties credited their rise to power to following guidance received through prophetic dreams. The Chinese kept extensive records of these experiences, creating libraries of dream reports that were studied by scholars for centuries. The Chinese also developed practical techniques for enhancing prophetic dreaming, including specific diets, meditation practices, and architectural designs for dream chambers. They believed that certain foods could enhance psychic abilities, that particular meditation postures could prepare the mind for time travel, and that sleeping in rooms designed according to feng shui principles could increase the likelihood of receiving prophetic visions. Buddhist and Hindu traditions have even more complex explanations for prophetic dreams, rooted in sophisticated philosophies about the nature of consciousness and reality. They suggest that individual consciousness is connected to a universal consciousness that exists outside of time, what Buddhists call the Buddha nature and Hindus refer to as Brahman. During deep sleep, when the ego is quiet and personal desires are temporarily suspended, people can sometimes access this universal awareness and see events that haven't happened yet in linear time. According to these traditions, prophetic dreams aren't about magic or supernatural abilities. They're about consciousness temporarily expanding beyond its normal limitations. Everyone has this potential, but most people's minds are too busy and distracted to access it effectively. The constant chatter of thoughts, worries, and desires creates a kind of mental noise that drowns out the subtle signals from universal consciousness. These Eastern philosophies teach that time is essentially an illusion created by the limited perspective of individual consciousness. From the viewpoint of universal awareness, all events, past, present, and future, exist simultaneously in an eternal now. Prophetic dreams occur when individual consciousness briefly merges with this universal perspective and gains access to information that appears to be from the future but is actually just from a different vantage point in the eternal present. Tibetan Buddhists practice something called dream yoga, where they train themselves to become conscious during dreams and use that state to gather information and insights that aren't available during waking hours. This practice requires years of meditation and mental discipline, but advanced practitioners report being able to consistently receive accurate information about future events through dream practices. The training for dream yoga involves learning to recognize when you're dreaming while still remaining in the dream state, what Western psychology calls lucid dreaming. But the Buddhist approach goes much further, teaching practitioners to use lucid dreams as a way of exploring the nature of reality and consciousness itself. They believe that the dream state offers a unique opportunity to experience how the mind creates reality, and that this understanding can lead to profound insights about the nature of time, causality, and human potential. Some Tibetan masters report being able to visit different time periods in their dreams, observing historical events or seeing future possibilities with remarkable clarity. They describe these experiences not as supernatural phenomena, but as natural functions of consciousness that become available when the mind is properly trained and prepared. Hindu traditions describe similar practices, using techniques like yoga nidra, a form of conscious sleep where practitioners maintain awareness while the body rests. During yoga nidra, experienced practitioners report being able to access what they call the Akashic records, a kind of cosmic library containing information about all events that have ever happened or will ever happen. They describe this not as a physical place, but as a state of consciousness where individual awareness expands to encompass universal knowledge. These Eastern approaches to prophetic dreaming are particularly interesting because they provide detailed, systematic methods for developing these abilities rather than just waiting for them to happen spontaneously. They treat prophetic dreaming as a skill that can be learned and refined through practice, similar to learning to play a musical instrument or master a martial art. Now, Modern science has a much more complicated relationship with prophetic dreams. And honestly, it's kind of fascinating how divided the scientific community is on this topic. Officially, most mainstream scientists are skeptical because precognition doesn't fit with our current understanding of physics and causality. The fundamental laws of physics, as we understand them, suggest that information can't travel backward through time, and that the future is determined by present conditions rather than being accessible to consciousness in advance. But unofficially, there's been some pretty interesting research that challenges these assumptions, and the results are more intriguing than most people realize. The scientific study of prophetic dreams faces significant challenges because it deals with subjective experiences that are difficult to measure and replicate under controlled conditions. How do you design a scientific experiment to test whether someone can dream about future events? How do you distinguish between genuine precognition and coincidence, wishful thinking, or unconscious pattern recognition? Dr. Dean Rodden at the Institute of Noetic Sciences has conducted numerous studies on precognitive dreams and found statistically significant results that suggest some people can occasionally access information about future events during sleep. His research indicates that this ability might be more common than we think, but that most people dismiss their prophetic dreams as coincidence because our culture doesn't provide a framework for understanding or validating these experiences. Rodden's experiments involve having participants record their dreams in detail, then comparing these reports to subsequent events to look for matches that are too specific and numerous to be explained by chance. His studies have found that certain individuals consistently produce dream reports that correlate with future events at rates significantly higher than would be expected from random guessing. One of the most interesting aspects of Rodden's research is his finding that prophetic dreams seem to work better for emotionally significant events. People are more likely to dream accurately about disasters, deaths, major life changes, and other emotionally charged situations than about mundane daily events. This suggests that prophetic dreaming might be related to the emotional significance of future events rather than just their chronological proximity. There's also fascinating research on something called displacement activity in the brain during REM sleep, conducted by neuroscientists who are trying to understand how the brain processes temporal information during dreams. Some researchers theorize that during certain phases of dreaming, the brain's normal temporal processing gets scrambled, potentially allowing consciousness to access memories from different time periods, including memories that haven't happened yet. Dr. Julia Mosbridge at Northwestern University has published papers suggesting that the unconscious mind can sometimes detect patterns and make predictions that the conscious mind isn't aware. OF. Her research indicates that the brain might be constantly processing subtle environmental cues and calculating probable futures, with this information sometimes emerging in dreams before it reaches conscious awareness. This theory suggests that what we call prophetic dreams might actually be the result of unconscious pattern recognition rather than genuine precognition. Mosbridge's work focuses on what she calls anomalous anticipatory activity, physiological responses that occur before emotional stimuli are presented, suggesting that the nervous system somehow anticipates future events. Her experiments show that people's autonomic nervous systems often react to emotional images several seconds before those images are actually shown, implying that some part of the mind is processing information about future events before they occur. But here's what's really interesting about the scientific research on prophetic dreams. Even skeptical scientists have trouble explaining away the most documented cases. When someone dreams specific details about a disaster and then that exact disaster happens exactly as dreamed, it's hard to dismiss as pure coincidence. The statistical probability of some prophetic dreams being accurate by chance is so low that it challenges our basic assumptions about how consciousness and time interact. Dr. Gary Schwartz at the University of Arizona has calculated the odds of some documented prophetic dreams being correct by coincidence, and the numbers are astronomical. For dreams that include multiple specific details about future events, locations, times, people involved, specific outcomes, the probability of accuracy by chance alone can be less than 1 in a million. This doesn't prove that precognition is real, but it suggests that our current scientific models might be incomplete. Some neuroscientists are exploring the possibility that consciousness operates according to quantum mechanical principles that allow for nonlinear temporal effects. Quantum physics has already demonstrated that particles can be entangled across vast distances, instantaneously affecting each other in ways that seem to violate classical physics. Some researchers speculate that consciousness might involve similar quantum effects that could theoretically allow for information to flow backward through time. Dr. Henry Stapp, a quantum physicist at UC Berkeley, has proposed that consciousness plays a fundamental role in quantum mechanics and that this could theoretically allow for precognitive experiences. His theories are highly speculative and controversial, but they provide a potential scientific framework for understanding how prophetic dreams might be possible within the laws of physics. The challenge for scientists studying prophetic dreams is that they're dealing with phenomena that exist at the intersection of neuroscience, psychology, physics, and philosophy. Current scientific methods are designed to study objective, measurable phenomena under controlled conditions. But dreams are subjective experiences that can't be directly observed or replicated. This creates a fundamental problem for applying traditional scientific approaches to understanding prophetic dreaming. Maybe our brains are capable of things we don't understand yet. Maybe consciousness is more complex and powerful than current scientific models suggest. Maybe the relationship between mind and time is more mysterious than we've assumed. The scientific study of prophetic dreams is still in its early stages, and it's possible that future discoveries will revolutionize our understanding of human consciousness and its relationship to time. One theory that's gaining acceptance among both scientists and skeptics is that prophetic dreams might be the result of unconscious pattern recognition. And honestly, this explanation is almost as fascinating as supernatural precognition because it suggests that our brains are capable of incredibly sophisticated analysis that we're not even aware of. Your brain is constantly processing millions of pieces of information that you're not consciously aware of. Subtle changes in people's behavior, environmental cues, social and political patterns, economic trends, health indicators, and countless other data points that your conscious mind either ignores or doesn't have the capacity to analyze. Think about it, every conversation you overhear, every news story you glance at, every change in someone's tone of voice or body language, every shift in weather patterns or social dynamics, all of this information is being processed by your brain, even when you're not paying conscious attention to it. During sleep, when conscious thought is quiet and the analytical mind isn't filtering and organizing information, the unconscious mind might be able to analyze all this accumulated data and extrapolate probable futures with remarkable accuracy. What feels like supernatural prophecy might actually be the brain's incredible ability to detect patterns and make predictions based on data that conscious awareness isn't processing or correlating. This theory explains why many prophetic dreams involve people close to the dreamer or situations the dreamer is familiar with. Your unconscious mind has more information about these familiar contexts, so it can make more accurate predictions about what might happen. If you know someone really well, your brain is constantly picking up on subtle changes in their behavior, health, relationships, and circumstances that might indicate future problems or changes. For example, if someone you know well has been showing subtle signs of health problems, changes in energy level, skin color, eating habits, sleep patterns, or emotional state, your unconscious mind might be processing these cues and calculating the probability of serious illness, even though your conscious mind hasn't explicitly recognized the pattern. A prophetic dream about that person's health crisis might actually be your brain's way of presenting its unconscious analysis of data you've been gathering without realizing it. This pattern recognition theory also explains why prophetic dreams often involve dramatic or emotionally significant events. These are the types of events that would be influenced by patterns your unconscious mind is most likely to detect: changes in health, relationship dynamics, environmental dangers, political tensions, or social conditions that could lead to disasters. Your brain is evolutionarily wired to be especially sensitive to potential threats and major changes that could affect survival and well-being. The theory becomes even more compelling when you consider how much information our brains process about environmental conditions and social dynamics. Before a natural disaster like an earthquake, there are often subtle environmental changes that animals can detect but humans consciously ignore: changes in groundwater, minor tremors, unusual animal behavior, electromagnetic fluctuations, and other signals that something is building beneath the surface. Your unconscious mind might be picking up on these environmental cues and correlating them with patterns from previous disasters, allowing it to predict when and where a major event might occur. A prophetic dream about an earthquake might actually be your brain's way of presenting its analysis of environmental data that your conscious mind hasn't recognized as significant. Similarly, before major social or political events like riots, economic crashes, or political upheavals, there are usually subtle warning signs that become obvious in hindsight but are difficult to recognize in advance. Changes in public mood, economic indicators, political rhetoric, social media patterns, and countless other factors create a complex web of information that might allow unconscious pattern recognition to predict future events. The pattern recognition theory also explains why some people seem to be better at prophetic dreaming than others. Individuals who are naturally observant, empathetic, or sensitive to environmental changes might unconsciously gather more relevant data about potential future events. People who work in fields that require pattern recognition, like medical diagnosis, financial analysis, or social work, might develop enhanced abilities to detect subtle cues and correlate them with likely outcomes. But even this rational explanation doesn't account for all documented cases of prophetic dreams. Some dreams predict random events or disasters that couldn't possibly be predicted through pattern recognition alone. Dreams that accurately predict lottery numbers, random accidents, or events involving people the dreamer has never met seem to involve information that simply couldn't be available through any normal sensory or cognitive process. There are also cases where prophetic dreams include specific details that couldn't be derived from pattern recognition: exact dates, specific locations the dreamer has never visited, names of people they've never heard of, or technical details about events they couldn't possibly understand. These cases suggest that either the pattern recognition theory is incomplete, or that human consciousness has access to information sources that current science doesn't recognize. Maybe the truth is some combination of pattern recognition and genuine precognition. Maybe our brains are constantly analyzing patterns and making predictions about probable futures. But maybe consciousness also occasionally accesses information through mechanisms we don't understand yet. Maybe some prophetic dreams result from sophisticated unconscious analysis, while others involve genuine glimpses of future events that exist outside the normal flow of causality. The pattern recognition theory provides a rational framework for understanding many prophetic dreams, but it also raises profound questions about the capabilities of human consciousness. If our brains can unconsciously process vast amounts of information and make accurate predictions about future events, then consciousness might be far more powerful and sophisticated than we currently realize. Maybe the line between normal pattern recognition and supernatural precognition isn't as clear as we think. Or maybe the answer is simpler and stranger than all our theories. Maybe some dreams are just windows into possibilities that exist parallel to our normal experience of reality, and occasionally those possibilities align with what actually happens in our timeline. Maybe consciousness operates according to principles we haven't discovered yet, principles that occasionally allow sleeping minds to glimpse the future with startling accuracy, whether through pattern recognition, quantum effects, or something else entirely that we haven't even imagined yet. Maybe the most honest answer is that we still don't really know how prophetic dreams work, but the evidence suggests that human consciousness is capable of things that challenge our current understanding of mind, time, and reality. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Some mysteries are worth preserving. Some questions are more interesting than their answers. And some aspects of human experience are too profound and complex to be fully explained by any single theory or scientific framework. Before we drift off into whatever dreams await us tonight, Let me share a few lesser-known stories about prophetic dreams that most people have never heard. Stories that are somehow even stranger than the famous cases everyone knows about. In 1923, a Swiss clockmaker named Klaus Weber started having the same dream every night for 6 months. In the dream, he was standing in his workshop when all of his clocks suddenly stopped working at exactly 3:17 a.m. Then he would hear a voice saying, "Time has run out for the clockmaker." Now, Klaus wasn't just any ordinary craftsman. He was considered one of the finest clockmakers in all of Switzerland, a man whose timepieces were so precise and beautiful that wealthy collectors from across Europe would travel to his small workshop in the Alps just to commission a single clock. His workshop was filled with dozens of clocks of every size and style, grandfather clocks with intricate wooden cases, delicate mantle clocks with gold filigree, pocket watches with movements so complex they seemed like mechanical poetry. Weber had inherited the clockmaking business from his father, who had learned the trade from his father before him. The Weber family had been making clocks for over 2 centuries, and Klaus took immense pride in continuing this tradition. He was known throughout the region for his meticulous attention to detail and his almost supernatural ability to diagnose problems with timepieces that other craftsmen couldn't repair. But this dream was unlike anything Klaus had ever experienced. Every night, without fail, he would find himself standing in his familiar workshop, surrounded by the gentle ticking and chiming of his beloved clocks. The workshop in his dream looked exactly as it did in real life. The same wooden workbenches covered with tiny gears and springs, the same tools hanging in perfect order on the walls, the same warm light filtering through the windows that overlooked the valley below. In the dream, Klaus would be working on a particularly complex clock movement, his skilled hands making the delicate adjustments that were second nature to him after decades of practice. But then, always at exactly 3:17 a.m. according to every clock in the workshop, something impossible would happen. Every single timepiece would suddenly stop working simultaneously. The gentle symphony of ticking that had provided the soundtrack to Klaus's entire life would cease instantly, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like death itself. Weber was so disturbed by this recurring dream that he documented it in his journal every day, noting any variations or new details with the same precision he brought to his clockmaking. He wrote down everything: the temperature of the air in the dream, the position of his hands when the clock stopped, the exact tone and pitch of the mysterious voice, even the way the light looked when it fell across his workbench. But the dream never changed. It was always the same workshop, always 3:17 a.m., always the same voice with the same ominous message. The consistency of the dream began to unnerve Klaus in ways he couldn't explain. He was a man of routine and precision, but this level of repetition felt unnatural, almost mechanical, as if his subconscious mind was stuck in some kind of temporal loop. Klaus began to dread going to sleep, knowing that he would once again experience the terrible moment when all time stopped in his world. He tried changing his bedtime, drinking warm milk, reading before sleep, even sleeping in different rooms of his house. Nothing worked. Every time he closed his eyes and drifted off, he would find himself back in that dream workshop, watching his life's work cease to function at exactly 3:17 a.m. The psychological impact of these dreams began affecting Klaus's waking life. He became obsessed with the time 3:17, checking his clocks constantly as that moment approached each morning and afternoon. He would find himself holding his breath as 3:17 arrived, half expecting all his real clocks to stop working just as they did in his dreams. Klaus also became increasingly focused on his own mortality and the passage of time. He had always been philosophical about the nature of time. It was impossible to work with clocks every day without thinking about how time moved and what it meant for human life. But his dreams intensified these contemplations to an almost unbearable degree. He began to see his clocks not just as beautiful mechanical objects, but as reminders of the relentless forward progress of time toward an inevitable ending. As the months passed, Klaus began to suspect that his dreams might be prophetic. He started making preparations that seemed rational to him but appeared strange to his family and friends. He wrote detailed letters to his wife and children, explaining his love for them and his gratitude for the life they had shared together. He organized his financial affairs with unusual thoroughness, making sure that every debt was paid and every important document was properly filed. Most remarkably, Klaus began carving his own headstone. He worked on it in secret in the back room of his workshop where he kept his rarest and most valuable clocks. Using the same precision and attention to detail that he brought to his timepieces, he carved an elaborate stone monument that included not just his birth date, but also the exact date and time of his death, March 17, 1924. At 3:17 a.m., when his wife discovered the headstone, she was terrified and begged Klaus to see a doctor. She thought he might be having some kind of mental breakdown, perhaps brought on by working too long with tiny mechanical parts and spending too much time in solitude. But Klaus insisted that he was perfectly sane and that he was simply preparing for something he knew was coming. On March 17, 1924, exactly 6 months after the dreams had started, Klaus Weber died of a heart attack in his workshop. His apprentice found his body the next morning, slumped over his workbench with a half-finished clock movement in his hands. And every single clock in his workshop had stopped working at exactly 3:17 a.m. The local newspaper called it the most precisely predicted death in Swiss history. The authorities investigated the stopped clocks, wondering if someone had deliberately tampered with them as some kind of elaborate hoax. But experts who examined the timepieces found no evidence of interference. The clocks had simply stopped working simultaneously, as if responding to some invisible signal that only they could detect. Klaus's workshop became something of a local attraction after his death. People would come from neighboring villages to see the room where a man had predicted his own death down to the exact minute, and where dozens of clocks had mysteriously stopped at the moment of his passing. Some visitors reported feeling an unusual sense of temporal displacement in the workshop, as if time moved differently there than in the outside world. Weber's family eventually turned the workshop into a small museum, preserving it exactly as it was on the morning Klaus died. The stopped clocks were never repaired. They remain frozen at 3:17 a.m. to this day, nearly a century later. Visitors often comment on the eerie silence in the room, so different from what it must have been like when it was filled with the sounds of functioning timepieces. The Klaus Weber case raises profound questions about the relationship between consciousness and time. How could a man's dreams predict not just his own death, but the exact moment when all his clocks would cease to function? Was it some kind of psychic connection between Klaus and his timepieces, or evidence that consciousness can sometimes access information about future events with impossible precision? Sometimes prophecy isn't about preventing the future sometimes. It's about accepting it with as much dignity and preparation as possible. Klaus Weber seemed to understand that his dreams weren't warnings meant to help him avoid death, but rather preparations that allowed him to face his fate with remarkable courage and foresight. In the 1940s, a largely unknown artist named Maria Santos lived in a small fishing village on the coast of Portugal, where the rhythm of life was determined by the tides and the weather patterns that swept in from the Atlantic Ocean. Maria was a quiet, introspective woman who supported herself by painting portraits of local families and landscapes that captured the austere beauty of her coastal home. But every few months, Maria would have intensely vivid dreams about disasters, earthquakes that split the earth open like broken pottery, floods that swept away entire towns, fires that consumed forests and cities with equal hunger, and accidents that happened with such specific detail that she could see the expressions on people's faces in the moments before tragedy struck. These dreams were unlike anything else Maria experienced in her otherwise peaceful life. When these disaster dreams came to her, Maria would wake up with an overwhelming compulsion to paint exactly what she had seen. She would stumble from her bed to her easel, sometimes still wearing her nightgown, and begin painting with the intensity and skill that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her normal artistic abilities. She would work for hours without stopping, as if channeling visions from some other realm directly onto her canvas. Maria's disaster paintings were remarkably detailed and technically accomplished, far beyond what anyone expected from a village artist who had never received formal training. She painted specific buildings burning in cities she had never visited, bridges collapsing over rivers she had never seen, ships sinking in storms that showed weather patterns with meteorological accuracy. Her neighbors thought she was obsessed with tragedy and death, creating dark fantasies that had no place in their simple coastal community. The paintings showed not just the disasters themselves, but the human stories within them, specific people fleeing from danger, families separated in chaos, rescuers working desperately to save lives. Maria would paint faces with such precision that they seemed like portraits of real individuals, even though she claimed never to have met any of the people who appeared in her disaster visions. Between 1943 and 1947, Maria created 43 disaster paintings based on her dreams. Her small house became crowded with these dark canvases, stacked against the walls like windows into possible futures. Local people found the paintings disturbing and morbid, wondering why someone would choose to spend their time creating such grim art when they lived in such a beautiful place. But as the years passed, something extraordinary began to happen. The disasters that Maria had painted started coming true with remarkable accuracy. A bridge in northern Spain collapsed during a flood, exactly as she had depicted it 2 years earlier. A passenger ship sank off the coast of Morocco in a storm that matched her painting down to the specific way the waves crashed over the vessel's deck. Buildings in various European cities burned in fires that followed the exact patterns she had shown in her art. 17 of Maria's disaster paintings came true with such precision that local newspapers began writing about the prophetic artist, who seemed to paint the future before it happened. Reporters would come to her village to interview Maria and photograph her paintings, trying to understand how an untrained artist in a remote coastal town could predict specific disasters in distant places with documentary accuracy. Maria herself was troubled by the attention and the growing realization that her dreams were somehow showing her real future events. She had initially thought the disaster paintings were just her imagination processing fears and anxieties, perhaps influenced by news reports about the war that was devastating Europe. But as more and more of her paintings proved to be prophetic, she began to understand that something far stranger was happening. The experience of creating prophetic art changed Maria profoundly. She began to see her painting as a responsibility rather than just creative expression. If her dreams were showing her real future disasters, then maybe her art was meant to serve some purpose, perhaps as warnings, or as a way of honoring the people who would suffer in these tragedies, or simply as testimony to events that needed to be witnessed and remembered. Maria started keeping detailed records of her disaster dreams, writing down everything she could remember about the visions and comparing them to the paintings she created. She noticed patterns in her dreams. They often came during certain phases of the moon. They were more vivid when she slept in particular positions, and they seemed to be triggered by emotional states that she couldn't quite identify or control. The most disturbing aspect of Maria's prophetic painting was her growing ability to see specific individuals who would be affected by the disasters. She would dream about particular families losing their homes, specific rescuers who would risk their lives to save others, and even individual animals that would be caught in the chaos. When these dreams proved accurate, Maria felt a profound sense of connection to people she had never met, but whose suffering she had witnessed in advance through her art. The most haunting painting in Maria's collection was her last one, a scene of her own village being destroyed by flooding. She painted specific houses underwater, including her own small cottage where she had spent her entire life. She showed the local church with water up to its bell tower. The fishing boats swept inland and smashed against buildings, and specific people from her village fleeing to higher ground with expressions of terror and disbelief. Maria showed this painting to her neighbors and begged them to prepare for a flood that would be unlike anything they had ever experienced. She warned them about which areas would be hit hardest, which escape routes would be safe, and when they should evacuate based on the weather patterns she had seen in her dream. Most villagers were skeptical, pointing out that their town had never experienced major flooding and was protected by natural barriers that seemed to make such a disaster impossible. But Maria's reputation as a prophetic artist had grown, and some people took her warning seriously. They quietly made preparations, moving valuable possessions to higher ground, planning evacuation routes, and keeping emergency supplies ready. The local priest even held special prayers for protection from flooding, though he admitted he wasn't entirely sure he believed in Maria's visions. 3 months after Maria completed her final painting, an unexpected dam failure in the mountains above their village caused massive flooding that destroyed most of the town exactly as she had depicted. The disaster played out like a live-action version of her painting. The same buildings were submerged, the same escape routes proved safe, and even specific details like which trees would be uprooted and where debris would accumulate matched her artistic vision with impossible precision. However, because Maria had warned the villagers and some had taken her advice seriously, most people were prepared and evacuated to safety before the worst flooding occurred. Lives were saved because an artist had dreamed about tomorrow and painted what she saw, and because some people had learned to trust in the possibility that art could sometimes serve as prophecy. The flood destroyed Maria's house and most of her paintings, but the prophetic artwork that remained became treasured artifacts in the region. The paintings were eventually donated to a museum in Lisbon, where they are studied by researchers interested in the relationship between artistic inspiration and precognitive experiences. After the flood, Maria never painted another disaster scene. She said her dreams had fulfilled their purpose and she could finally sleep peacefully without visions of tragedy and destruction. She spent her remaining years painting flowers and landscapes as if her subconscious had finished whatever work it needed to do through her art and could finally rest. Maria's story raises fascinating questions about the relationship between creativity and prophecy. Was her artistic ability somehow connected to her capacity for prophetic dreams? Did the act of painting the disasters help them manifest in reality? Or was she simply documenting events that were already destined to happen? And why did her prophetic ability fade away after the flood that affected her own community? Sometimes prophetic dreams seem to have specific purposes, not just showing the future, but providing information that can be used to prevent tragedy or help people prepare for inevitable changes. Maria Santos discovered that her gift for seeing disaster was also a gift for helping others survive it, and that art could serve as a bridge between the world of dreams and the world of practical action. In 1962, a 7-year-old boy named Timothy Mitchell in the countryside of Yorkshire, England, started telling his parents about his future memories, experiences that he described as remembering things that had already happened, but that nobody else remembered because they hadn't happened yet. Timothy's way of describing these experiences was so matter-of-fact and innocent that it took his parents weeks to understand that their son was having what appeared to be prophetic visions with remarkable accuracy. Timothy was an ordinary child in most ways. He enjoyed playing with toy cars, reading adventure books, and exploring the fields and woods around their family farm. He was bright and curious, but not particularly unusual compared to other children his age. His parents, Robert and Eleanor Mitchell, were practical farming people who had little interest in supernatural phenomena or unexplained mysteries. But starting in the autumn of 1962, Timothy began having conversations with his parents that were unlike anything they had experienced. He would wake up in the morning and casually mention things like, "I remember when grandfather dies next spring," or "I remember the day when we get the new red car." When his parents asked him what he meant, Timothy would explain that he had dreams where he could see things that were going to happen. But in the dreams, it felt like he was remembering events that had already occurred. Timothy's future memories were incredibly specific and detailed. He described technological advances that wouldn't be invented for decades. He talked about people carrying small computers in their pockets that could show moving pictures and connect them to anyone in the world. He described watching movies on flat screens that hung on walls like pictures, and cars that could drive themselves without any person steering them. His parents assumed these were just the wild imaginings of a creative child who had been influenced by science fiction stories. But Timothy also described smaller, more immediate events that his parents could verify. He predicted the exact date his grandfather would die, March 10th, 1963, and described details about the funeral that proved accurate down to what flowers would be in the arrangements and who would attend the service. He predicted the day his baby sister would be born, several months before his mother even knew she was pregnant. and correctly described the complications that would occur during the delivery. Timothy also made predictions about their neighbors and community that consistently proved accurate. He predicted which houses in their village would be sold and to whom, often months before the owners had any intention of moving. He correctly forecasted which crops would fail due to weather problems, which local businesses would close, and even which children in his school would become sick with specific illnesses. What made Timothy's predictions particularly remarkable was the casual way he delivered them. He never seemed to think his future memories were unusual or supernatural to him. They were just another type of memory, like remembering what he had for breakfast or what game he had played the day before. He would mention future events in the same tone he used to talk about past experiences, as if time was just another dimension he could move through naturally. Timothy's parents initially tried to discourage these predictions, worried that their son was developing some kind of psychological problem or unhealthy obsession with predicting the future. They consulted their family doctor, who suggested that Timothy might be unconsciously picking up on subtle cues from adult conversations and making educated guesses about likely outcomes. But as Timothy's predictions became more numerous and more accurate, this rational explanation seemed increasingly inadequate. The local vicar, Reverend Williams, became interested in Timothy's case after the boy accurately predicted a fire that would destroy part of the village church. Timothy had described the fire in detail, which section of the building would be damaged, how the fire would start, and even which artifacts would be saved by quick-thinking parishioners. When the fire occurred exactly as Timothy had described, Reverend Williams began keeping a written record of the boy's predictions. Over the course of 2 years, Reverend Williams documented more than 200 specific predictions that Timothy made, ranging from global events like political changes and natural disasters to local occurrences like accidents and personal milestones in their community. The accuracy rate was extraordinary. Over 80% of Timothy's predictions eventually came true, and many of them included details that couldn't possibly have been guessed or deduced from available information. Some of Timothy's most remarkable predictions involved technological developments that were decades ahead of their time. In 1963, he described machines that could record television programs and play them back later, technology. That wouldn't become common until the 1980s. He talked about phones that could show pictures of the people you were talking to, computers that could understand spoken commands, and devices that could instantly translate between different languages. Timothy also made predictions about space exploration that proved remarkably accurate. He described people walking on the moon, space stations where astronauts could live for months at a time, and machines that could land on other planets and send back pictures. These predictions were made years before the first successful moon landing and at a time, when space travel was still largely theoretical. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Timothy's future memories was his description of social and cultural changes that would occur over the following decades. He talked about dramatic changes in music, fashion, and social attitudes that wouldn't become apparent until the late 1960s and 1970s. He described social movements and political changes with remarkable accuracy, as if he had witnessed these developments firsthand from some future vantage point. As Timothy grew older, his future memories became less frequent and less detailed. By the time he was 10 years old, the prophetic experiences had mostly stopped, and by age 12, they had disappeared entirely. Timothy himself didn't seem troubled by the loss of this ability. If anything, he seemed relieved to have his dreams return to normal childhood, concerns like adventures and fantasies rather than glimpses of future realities. Timothy grew up to lead a completely ordinary life, working as an engineer and raising a family of his own. He remembered having the prophetic experiences as a child, but the memories felt distant and dreamlike, as if they had happened to someone else. He occasionally wondered if the experiences had been real, or if they were elaborate childhood fantasies that had seemed real at the time. But researchers who studied Timothy's case and analyzed Reverend Williams' detailed records concluded that the accuracy and specificity of the boy's predictions couldn't be explained by coincidence, educated guessing, or unconscious pattern recognition. Many of Timothy's technological predictions were so advanced and specific that they seemed to require genuine foreknowledge of developments that wouldn't occur for decades. The Timothy Mitchell case has become one of the most studied examples of prophetic abilities in children, raising questions about whether young minds might have access to information about the future that becomes unavailable as the brain develops and becomes more focused on present moment awareness. Some researchers theorize that childhood consciousness might be less constrained by linear time perception, allowing children to occasionally access information from different temporal periods. Timothy's story also suggests that prophetic abilities might serve specific developmental purposes and then fade away when they're no longer needed. Perhaps some children are temporarily given access to future information to help them navigate particular challenges or to prepare them for roles they will play later in life. Timothy's accurate predictions about technological developments may have influenced his later decision to become an engineer, as if his childhood visions were preparing him for a career where he would contribute to creating the very technologies he had foreseen. The case raises profound questions about the nature of time, memory, and human consciousness. If a 7-year-old boy could accurately describe technological and social developments that wouldn't occur for decades, what does this tell us about the relationship between individual awareness and the flow of historical events? Are some people occasionally given glimpses of the future to help them understand their place in the larger patterns of human development? Timothy himself never provided clear answers to these questions. As an adult, he would sometimes wonder if his childhood experiences had been real prophetic visions or simply an unusual form of imagination that had coincidentally aligned with future developments. But the detailed records kept by Reverend Williams provide compelling evidence that some children might occasionally access information about the future with remarkable accuracy, even if they lose this ability as they mature into ordinary adult consciousness. There's one final story that I find absolutely fascinating, though it's more mysterious than the others and involves not just one person but several different individuals across multiple countries and decades. In the 1970s, several different authors in different parts of the world started having dreams about visiting a vast library filled with books that hadn't been written yet, a repository of all future literature existing in some dimension parallel to our normal reality. These authors, who didn't know each other and lived thousands of miles apart, all described the same impossible place in their dreams, with such consistent detail that researchers eventually began to suspect they were accessing some kind of shared unconscious space that existed outside normal time and geography. The library they described was unlike any building that existed in the physical world, yet each dreamer's account matched the others with remarkable precision. Margaret Thornton, a novelist living in Edinburgh, Scotland, was the first to write publicly about these experiences. In 1973, she published an article in a literary magazine describing recurring dreams where she would find herself in an enormous library, with shelves that stretched upward beyond the reach of any ladder, filled with millions of books that contained stories no one had written yet. The library was illuminated by a soft, sourceless light that made reading comfortable without creating shadows, and the air had a quality that made every breath feel like inspiration itself. In Margaret's dreams, she could pull books from the shelves and read complete novels, poetry collections, and plays that wouldn't be published for years or decades. The books were perfectly formed. They had detailed plots, fully developed characters, and writing styles that were distinctively different from each other, as if they had been created by hundreds of different authors from different time periods and cultural backgrounds. What made Margaret's experience particularly intriguing was that the books seemed to be organized according to some cosmic filing system that grouped literature by themes, emotional resonance, and spiritual significance rather than by author or publication date. She found sections devoted to books that heal broken hearts, stories that reveal hidden truths, and poems that connect souls across time. The organization suggested that all literature existed in some eternal realm, where its essential purpose was more important than its temporal origins. Within months of Margaret's article being published, other writers began coming forward with similar experiences. A poet named Carlos Mendez in Mexico City described visiting the same library in his dreams, identifying it by specific architectural details that matched Margaret's description perfectly. A playwright named Hiroshi Tanaka in Tokyo reported dream visits to an identical library where he had read entire theatrical works that wouldn't be written for decades. But the most compelling evidence came from a novelist named Janet Richardson in Toronto, who had been having these library dreams for over a year before reading Margaret's article. Janet had actually written down detailed summaries of novels she had read in the dream library, including specific plot points, character developments, and even memorable quotations from the imaginary books. When she compared her dream journals to Margaret's published description, the similarities were so extensive that they seemed to confirm that both women were visiting the same impossible place. The phenomenon became even more mysterious when these authors started discovering connections between their dream experiences and real-world publishing events. Margaret had read a complete science fiction novel in the dream library about time travelers who could only move backward through history, never forward. 3 years later, a debut author named David Chun published a novel with an almost identical plot, claiming it was entirely original work that had come to him through a series of vivid dreams. When Margaret contacted David and described the novel she had read in the dream library, he was astonished to discover that her summary matched his published book with remarkable accuracy, including specific character names, plot twists, and thematic elements that he thought were his own creative innovations. David admitted that his novel had indeed come to him through dreams, but he had assumed the dreams were his own subconscious creativity rather than access to some external source of literary inspiration. Similar incidents began occurring with other authors who reported library dreams. Carlos found that poems he had read in the dream library were later published by poets he had never heard of, with only minor variations in wording and structure. Hiroshi discovered that plays he had witnessed in the library were later produced by theater companies, written by playwrights who claimed the works were entirely original. As word of these experiences spread through literary communities, researchers began investigating the phenomenon more systematically. They found that dozens of writers across different countries and languages were reporting similar dreams about the same impossible library, and that many of them were discovering later publications that matched works they had encountered in their dreams. Dr. Patricia Chambers, a psychologist at Oxford University who specialized in creativity and consciousness, began collecting detailed accounts from writers who reported library dreams. She found that the experiences shared several consistent characteristics. The dreamers always described the same architectural features, the same quality of light, and the same organizational system for the books. They also reported that time moved differently in the library. They could spend what felt like hours reading complete novels, but they would wake up having slept for only a few minutes. Most intriguingly, Dr. Chambers discovered that many of the writers who had library dreams later published works that were remarkably similar to books they claimed to have read in the dream library, even though they insisted their published works were original creations. This suggested that the library dreams might represent some kind of collective unconscious repository of literary potential, where all possible stories existed simultaneously, and could be accessed by writers whose consciousness was somehow attuned to this creative dimension. The library dreams gradually stopped happening for most of the writers who had experienced them, as if they had been given temporary access to some cosmic repository of future creativity and then returned to relying on their individual imagination and inspiration. But the writers who had visited the library reported that the experience permanently changed their understanding of creativity and the source of artistic inspiration. Margaret Thornton wrote that visiting the library had convinced her that all literature already exists in some eternal realm, and that writers are simply conduits who help bring specific works into physical manifestation at the appropriate time. She began to see her role as an author not as creating something entirely new, but as discovering and translating works that already existed in a dimension where all possible stories were simultaneously real. The implications of the library dreams extend beyond literature to fundamental questions about the nature of creativity, consciousness, and time. If multiple people can access the same repository of future creative works through dreams, what does this suggest about the relationship between individual imagination and collective human potential? Are artistic ideas somehow predetermined, existing in some universal creative consciousness that individual artists can occasionally tap into? Some writers who experienced the library dreams became convinced that all creative work is really just remembering things that already exist somewhere else. In some dimension where all possibilities are simultaneously real. They began to see creativity not as the generation of something new, but as the discovery and manifestation of eternal truths that exist outside normal space and time. The library of unwritten books remains one of the most intriguing examples of shared prophetic dreaming, suggesting that human consciousness might have access to collective repositories of knowledge and creativity that exist beyond individual experience. Whether these dreams represent genuine access to future literature, sophisticated forms of telepathic communication between creative minds, or complex manifestations of the collective unconscious, they raise profound questions about the nature of artistic inspiration and the mysterious sources of human creativity. Sometimes I wonder if all creative work is really just remembering things that already exist somewhere else, in some dimension where all possibilities are simultaneously real. Maybe artists and writers are just people who occasionally dream about visiting that place where everything that could be written already has been written, where every story that could be told is waiting patiently on infinite shelves for the right person to discover it and bring it into our world. Maybe our dreams aren't predictions of the future at all. Maybe they're memories of visiting places where time works differently, where past and future exist side by side like books in a library. And we can occasionally wander through and glimpse what's waiting for us in the chapters we haven't read yet. Sometimes the most extraordinary journeys happen while we're asleep, when consciousness is free to explore realms that exist beyond the boundaries of normal waking experience. And sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we return from these journeys with stories that remind us that reality is far stranger and more wonderful than we usually dare to imagine, if you're somehow still awake. Which honestly surprises me. You've just journeyed through some of the most documented cases of dreams that accurately predicted the future. From ancient Rome to modern times, from emperors to ordinary people, consciousness seems to occasionally transcend the normal boundaries of time and space. I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you've ever had a dream that came true, whether it was something significant or just a small, strange detail, drop it in the comments. These stories remind us that the line between dreaming and reality might be more blurred than we usually assume. Maybe tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you'll visit that mysterious place where time moves differently. Maybe you'll glimpse something from tomorrow, or next week, or next year. And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll forget all about it and just sleep peacefully until morning. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy falling asleep to these strange journeys through the mysteries of human consciousness. We'll be back next week with another exploration of the weird, wonderful, and sometimes disturbing ways that our minds connect us across time and space. Sleep tight and remember, sometimes our dreams know things we don't. Sometimes the future whispers to us while we sleep. And sometimes, if we listen carefully, we can hear tomorrow calling our names from somewhere just beyond the edge of consciousness. See you in your dreams.